It has long been the mission of the SCP Foundation to secure and contain any anomalies they encounter, all to protect the safety of the human race. Sometimes containing an SCP is a trivial task, as simple as guarding a room or keeping an eye on an artifact with strange but mostly harmless properties. Other times, though, anomalies require a considerable number of the Foundation's personnel and resources to keep them under control. This latter category commonly includes some of the most dangerous creatures and entities that the SCP Foundation keeps under lock and key. However, while it might be only in very rare cases, every so often an SCP comes along with its very own built-in method of containment. This can often be the result of someone encountering an anomaly and discovering the perfect way of imprisoning it before the SCP Foundation comes along and steals all the credit. Undoubtedly, this makes the job of securing an anomaly all the easier for the Foundation's staff. After all, someone else has already done the hard part of the job for them. Or rather, it would make things easier if only the Foundation's own researchers chose not to interfere, and could leave a deadly threat kept safely in its box without trying to find out what makes it tick. SCP-5001 is, in some ways, a reminder that some things are best left alone, but it is also a grave warning not to tamper with that which you do not understand. Both of these lessons would soon be imparted on the SCP Foundation. Buried 60 kilometers below the ground in northern Russia is SCP-5001, a 53-kilometer wide structure. It is an enormous biomechanical machine, but to the untrained eye there is nothing anomalous about the object. And according to the Foundation's findings, this is indeed the case. There is nothing inherently anomalous about the structure itself. But there are a number of characteristics that seem to suggest it is, in some way, connected to anomalous phenomena. For one, there is the sheer scale of the structure, and then there's the records that were uncovered about SCP-5001, which appear to have been monitoring and tracking its status. Perhaps whoever constructed it or discovered it kept a record as they observed the structure. Nothing too out of the ordinary about that. But what's strange is that these date back to 11,000 BC. And yet were somehow made with modern systems of measurement. And other weirder documents have been recovered from inside of SCP-5001. Records written in languages from all over the world, and even some in languages lost to time. Among them are papers in Phoenician, Ancient Hebrew, both Ancient and Modern Greek, Latin, Anglo-Saxon, along with Modern Russian, English, and Mandarin. Some of these documents are even written in languages that the SCP Foundation's top researchers are yet to properly identify. The explanation for all this would seem obvious, wouldn't it? Writing in both ancient and contemporary languages, records that date all the way back to the last of the prehistoric era, it all seems to point in a certain direction. Somehow, SCP-5001 has a link to time travel. Perhaps it was even a hub for a group of time travelers, right? Wrong. The Foundation already thought that this might be the case and checked for any signs of temporal anomalies. And yet, they found nothing. No evidence to suggest that there had ever been any time travel near or using SCP-5001. There were no devices on site that could affect time, and no traces of any residue or fallout from a temporal occurrence. So what exactly does this thing even do? Well, we're afraid to say the Foundation researchers have been stumped on the answer to that question too, and they are not the only ones either. Way back in the 50s, the GRU's Division P also had an interest in SCP-5001. For anyone who isn't already acquainted with them, they are one of the SCP Foundation's numerous groups of interest, a list of organizations, corporations, and agencies from around the world who have also had dealings with anomalies. In the case of GRU-P, they were originally a division of the Russian Army during the Cold War. The specialty of GRU Division P was the acquisition of anomalous objects and entities. In other words, they were the Soviet Union's very own SCP Foundation. In 1953, GRU Division P was alerted to abnormal seismic activity in a narrow region of northern Russia. A team was immediately sent in to investigate and began attempting to take seismic measurements of the area in question. During their various experiments and tests, GRU Division P realized a discrepancy in their readings. Again and again, they checked and double-checked their results. only to discover that this reading wasn't the result of faulty equipment or even human error. There was something big nearby. What they hadn't yet realized was around 30 kilometers away, deep underground, was SCP-5001. Immediately, GRU Division P began drilling towards the location of SCP-5001, but for years found that they were unable to breach the exterior of the structure. Defeated, the project was abandoned in 1955. However, Soviet leader First Secretary Khrushchev seemed to have a vested interest in gaining access to SCP-5001. As a result, he privately funded the GRU Division P operation, allowing them to continue their work in secret for a number of years, from 1959 until Khrushchev was disposed in 1964. Of course, this was all during the height of the Cold War, but by the late 1960s, international relations between the Soviet Union and the United States of America were starting to ease. Thanks to the relaxing tensions, a contract was introduced allowing the two nations' secret organizations to work together on a number of operations involving potentially dangerous anomalies. This meant that the SCP Foundation was finally able to step in and contribute to the GRU Division P's project concerning SCP-5001. Their first task? Actually getting inside the subterranean structure. Naturally, given how well-versed the Foundation is in dealing with anomalies, they had ideas for how to crack this nut. By acquiring anomalous technology from the Global Occult Coalition, another group of interest, as well as experimental designs created by one Dr. Elijah Rachma, the SCP Foundation were finally able to breach the structure in 1971. From then until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the SCP Foundation and GRU Division P worked together to conduct a number of studies into the origin and purpose of SCP-5001. Both organizations were curious as to the technology the structure possessed, and attempts were even made to recreate some of the devices found within. Among this advanced technology were ontological stabilizers, also known as Scranton reality anchors, which are located around SCP-5001's inner chamber. These were designed to directly alter the amount of Humes in a given area. What's a Hume? Well, to keep it simple, a Hume is a measure of the reality around us. If it helps, imagine reality as a pile of sand. Now imagine that you remove a single grain of sand from the pile. Congratulations, you just removed one Hume from this reality. Taking one away doesn't really do much, but start grabbing handfuls and the pile gets smaller, scattered. Less a pile and more a light dusting of sand. Reality works the same way. Take too much away and it starts to lose whatever it was before. Being able to alter the amount of Humes in an area meant that these ontological stabilizers could alter the strength of reality itself, even nullify the reality-bending properties of some anomalies. In theory, an SCP with the power to influence reality could be contained using this technology. The effects of their abilities reduced significantly, although not negated entirely. Another noteworthy piece of technology uncovered was codenamed Omega. Omega was discovered in an unmarked room on a computer terminal that was connected to every area of SCP-5001 by dozens of cables. The software itself was an artificial intelligence construct, a computerized consciousness that seemed to serve the purpose of controlling the various systems within SCP-5001. The Omega seemed to work by providing an answer whenever someone used a keyboard to input a question. The artificial intelligence of Omega appeared able to hold a conversation, but would refuse to give any insight into when the SCP-5001 structure was built or what its purpose was. Despite neither group knowing what SCP-5001's function was, an agreement between the SCP Foundation and GRU Division P was formed. Both organizations shared the belief that Omega, the ontological stabilizers, as well as the other anomalous technologies could never, under any circumstances, be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. They had a pact to keep the knowledge of SCP-5001 and these devices strictly between themselves. However, this agreement was, sadly, not to last. In the early 90s, GRU Division P liquidated its assets and disbanded. A number of the Russian division's highest-ranking officers stole the anomalous technology that the organization had in its possession, which they then sold to Marshall Carter and Dark Limited. MC&D Ltd are yet another of the SCP Foundation's groups of interest. According to Foundation intelligence, Marshall Carter and Dark Limited is a London-based club that has caused numerous problems for the Foundation over the years. They have ties to wealthy figures across the globe, and cater to the super-rich clientele by providing them with the most exclusive, expensive, and rare experiences available. How do they do this? By gathering the anomalous items and auctioning them off to the highest bidders. A number of GRU Division P operatives also joined up with the Chaos Insurgency. This is a group of interest that consists of personnel who previously worked for the Foundation, but have since broken away to pursue their own rogue agenda. Much like a number of other groups of interest, the Insurgency uses anomalies and SCPs for their own benefit, as well as dabbling in a bit of arms dealing and the selling of highly classified intelligence. Hey, it's good to have a diverse portfolio. Despite former members of GRU Division P seeking alternative employment with some less than reputable groups, the SCP Foundation still managed to keep the existence and location of SCP-5001 a closely guarded secret. However, even with the structure fully under their control, their leading researchers were still baffled as to what exactly the purpose of the underground structure was, or rather, that was the case. On December 30th, 2019, an explosion erupted in the northeast sector of SCP-5001. The cause of the explosion was unknown, but the damage caused a tremendous and almost catastrophic loss of power. Whether the explosion had been triggered by one of the many groups of interest, like the former GRU Division P, or just a machinery malfunction, it almost caused the total destruction of SCP-5001. What would be so bad about that? Well, remember earlier when we said that every so often an SCP comes along with its very own built-in method of containment? You see, it wasn't the structure or technology of SCP-5001 that the Foundation should have been worried about. It was the thing inside of SCP-5001. Just as some Foundation researchers had long theorized, SCP-5001 was a cage, a containment unit for its own anomalous objects within, something powerful enough to alter reality right down to the Humes, hence the need for ontological stabilizers to dampen its power, and Omega to keep the place running. This entity, known either as SCP-5001-A or the Devourer, was being held inside SCP-5001, and when the structure was damaged, it was almost freed. While there was no data on SCP-5001's computer system about this being's appearance or the extent of its anomalous powers, whoever created SCP-5001 went to considerable effort to keep the Devourer contained, viewing it as a threat to all of reality. And all that effort was almost undone when the structure was damaged by the explosion. Fortunately, the SCP Foundation was able to re-establish containment of SCP-5001-A, though at the cost of a tremendous amount of lives. When personnel were finally permitted to re-enter SCP-5001, a number of the structure's core systems had been damaged, but it was still able to perform its primary function and keep the Devourer safely contained within. As personnel entered the structure, a message appeared through the Omega computer system that read, "Hello, my children. Although you have grown immensely since your earliest days, you have much room to grow. Your species' intellect is merely a bud with so much potential. Your weapons are powerful. Your medicine is supreme. Your engineering is beautiful. With proper guidance and care, you are sure to reach an elevated state of being and transcend your bodies for something more whole and perfect. That is why it pains me so dearly to request that you leave this place immediately. Your studying and probing have almost resulted in the end of all I have worked towards to keep you alive. If you comply, I guarantee that the Devourer will never escape, and your species will be free to pursue the enlightenment of technology for all eternity. Let this be my final gift to you, directly from the center of my broken heart." Okay, back up. Broken heart? Interesting. Where have we heard something like that before? We'd hate to jump to any conclusions, but when one hears about a being of great power related to large and mysterious machines, and that word again, broken, all the groups of interest that seem to be tied into SCP-5001, and we'd neglected to mention perhaps the most important of all, the Church of the Broken God. This religious organization that reveres industry and technology over the impurity of flesh has been united in a singular purpose, rebuilding their deity, the broken god Mechane, whose body was split apart in an attempt to preserve the future of mankind. Perhaps the heart of this great and ancient machine, This Devourer is actually the heart of something else entirely. Though of course, there's only so much we can speculate. Knowledge, after all, can sometimes be like a flame. It can light your way, but if you get too close, you will inevitably be burned. If ever you're in doubt, ask the people devoured and assimilated by the heart of Mecane the last time it was freed by the church. If ever the heart gets out again, you'll certainly be with them. The SCP Foundation has come so far. Their technology, their knowledge, their vast resources all allow them to contain some of the most powerful forces mankind has ever seen, and even some we haven't. But as SCP-5001 shows, there is still much that even the brightest researchers at the Foundation don't yet understand, and their drive to poke and prod at the unknown nearly led to the end of reality as we know it. Perhaps one day we'll be able to fully understand just what the Devourer is, and the ways that SCP-5001 worked to protect us from it, but we're not there yet, and there's no guarantee that we ever will be. While the pursuit of knowledge is always an admirable one, when it comes to SCP-5001, maybe the Foundation should have left well enough alone. In 1961, the SCP Foundation discovered a town that was completely devoid of all life. Not long before their arrival, Darrington, North Carolina had been a community with high aspirations, a deeply religious township of devout Christians, many of whom were seeking greater prosperity from their lives. But now their home was a ghost town, with no sign of any prior Darrington resident to be found. Where in the hell had they all gone? It hardly seemed like the population of an entire town would all simultaneously decide to up sticks and leave to pastures new. But then again, maybe the citizens of Darrington hadn't left at all. Perhaps they weren't even really still human and had taken up residence somewhere much darker, like underground. This is the story of one of the earliest known instances of a phenomenon now known under the designation of SCP-3089, or to use its alternative name, that old-time religion. When the SCP Foundation arrived in a desolate Darrington to find the townsfolk had all vanished, they immediately began an investigation into the exact hows and whys, the answers to what exactly had happened here. After all, while not a huge place, Darrington was home to nearly 1,000 residents, and that many people don't just disappear, if they even had disappeared and weren't just dormant. But what the Foundation uncovered was a gruesome discovery that led them to not only demolishing the entire North Carolinian town, but purchasing all the land around it to keep the area under permanent observation. Prior to the demolition, however, the Ministry of Sevenfold Blessing had been one of the oldest buildings in Darrington, much like most town churches. And it was while searching the offices of this church that the Foundation cleanup crews discovered their first piece of evidence, the initial clue about what had happened to this deserted town. They recovered a series of cassette tapes, each with a recording of sermons that had been given within the Ministry of Sevenfold Blessing. These were all delivered by one Pastor Bartholomew Jenner, the first having been recorded on August 17th of 1959, 2 years earlier. "My friends, I want to talk to you about what the Bible offers tonight," Pastor Jenner began in the first of these recordings. "I want to talk to you about what you are owed. I want to talk to those of you who are struggling right now. To those of you who have hardship and pain. Maybe you've heard that the Bible only nourishes the spirit, that God only provides for our immortal souls. Well, my friends, I'm here to tell you that this is simply not true." Pastor Bartholomew Jenner seemed to be focused on the discussion of very real, relatable problems. After all, what person hasn't felt unsatisfied with their life at one point or another? And this was apparently no different for the people of Darrington. Many of you can think of places in your lives where you have not yet risen, where you are not yet victorious. Marriage, finances, health. But do not fret, my friends, God wants you to rise. He has cleared a path for you. It is one littered with his earthly treasures. To claim them, you only need to shed your old selves and be reborn. The pastor was merely using the shared faith of the township to help reaffirm that their struggles were not the be-all end-all of their lives. Or at least, that's how it first appeared. But the religious practices taking place in this first recording would soon take a bizarre turn. making it clear there was something far more sinister, even cult-like, going on in the ministry of sevenfold blessing. Now, if you would, some of the ladies from the mayor's office were kind enough to collect these cicada shells. Pass along, each of you take one. Yes, the children too. Be careful, very careful. They are fragile. Each of you take one and hold it in your left hand. Yes, the left hand, not the right. Your left. The shells of dead cicadas hardly seemed like common fare for a sermon like this. Although as the recording continued, it was easy to understand that Pastor Jenner intended these discarded insect carapaces to be something of a metaphor, even if they were pretty gross, especially to some of the younger members of his congregation. He explained to the Darrington residents that these cicada shells were meant to be symbolic of whatever hardship the citizens were currently struggling with in their lives, whether it was work, a marriage, or an ill family member. Then came the next part of this unorthodox practice. The pastor instructed everyone in the congregation to picture themselves holding their biggest problem in their left hand. Now I want you to squeeze your left hand. Squeeze it into a fist. Feel that problem cracking like old dried out paper. Feel it crumble to dust. Jenner told them, and the residents of Darrington did so, crushing the cicada shells until there was nothing left. Everyone open your eyes. Don't you feel better? Stronger. This is what is offered. Our hardships are like the shell. We shall cast them aside even as they crumble. God has cleared a path. Needless to say, the Foundation agents that recovered the tapes of Pastor Jenner's odd sermons weren't exactly sure what to make of them. And as unusual as they were, the recordings did little to indicate where the townspeople of Darrington, North Carolina had disappeared to. But as they listened further, what they found was even more unsettling than an entire congregation of people crushing cicada shells. In the second recording, dated December 19th of 1959, Pastor Jenner was once again presiding over his congregation. He had just finished quoting a passage from Matthew chapter 25, verse 30, which related to a biblical tale known as the Parable of the Talents. In this story, a master puts his servants in charge of a differently sized portion of his wealth while he is away, then judges them based on whether or not his servants make a profit using his money. The third servant, who had received the least talents, meaning an amount of money, was punished for burying his share in the ground. Cast out into the outer darkness, to face weeping and gnashing of teeth. It was after making mention of this unprofitable servant that Pastor Jenner went on to address even more of the bizarre, almost ritualistic practices he had been introducing to his sermons. Now, some of you have expressed concerns over the new sacraments. A few have even called them sacrilege. And yet, have we not prospered? Have these same naysayers, these same doubting Thomases, not profited from our good works? The pastor declared, I have shown you how to heal the sick with the Lord's Prayer and the blood of an unbaptized child. I have shown you how to see your future in the stemming entrails of a quivering crow. I have shown you the path to glory. But I cannot make you follow this path. I can only show it to you. It is you and you alone who must follow it, who must rise and shed your old self. Shed your old self. The words immediately called to mind the image of the cicadas, insects that discard their outer carapaces and emerge anew, bugs that also burrow into the ground and wait, lying dormant under the earth for years at a time, all before they emerge, rising up again, so they can spread. It was becoming clear that Pastor Jenner was certainly deviating further and further from the church's normal religious practices. His bold and blatant descriptions of what sounded like ritualistic sacrifices were shocking enough to hear, speaking of using blood and entrails to bring the town the prosperity it sought. But if that wasn't bad enough, the worst was still yet to come, contained within the third and final recording. Unlike the previous cassettes, most of the sermon from June 7, 1960 was almost completely unintelligible, and without any visual evidence to go along with it, it was hard for the Foundation to make out exactly what was going on. It began with another quote from Matthew, this time chapter 28, verse 6, which made mention of the resurrection of Jesus, that he had risen, and that people should come and see where the Lord lay. Not a metaphor, my friends, Pastor Jenner explained before urging his congregation to join in some kind of formation. Step forward, mothers behind their daughters, fathers behind their sons. Turn to face the recording became unintelligible again after that point, with only a few more words being audible. The pastor seemed to have gathered the townsfolk of Darrington, presumably for some new form of ritual. He encouraged the town's children to close their eyes and pray, before reminding the congregation that God sacrificed the life of his only son, Jesus. Frighteningly, it appeared that Pastor Jenner was implying the adults of Darrington should do the same. One of the next fragments of his sermon that could be deciphered declared, "Lamb is slaughtered to feed the lion, the son is slaughtered to feed." Between more and more noise interfering with the recording, Pastor Jenner could be heard saying, "The pact is complete. This world shall be our paradise," before he encouraged his congregation, or those who were left, to dig deep and wait. Then came perhaps the most horrifying part of the tape. The remainder of the recording lasted 30 minutes, comprised of pure static. Or the Foundation agents listening to it assumed at first that it was just interference, but further audio analysis seemed to suggest that the long, continuous mass of hissing wasn't static at all. It was the chittering sound of insects, like the noise made by cicadas. For a time, the incident at Darrington left the Foundation baffled. There seemed to be no clear answer as to what had happened. Not one of the town's residents were anywhere to be found. And on top of that, there were no bodies, no remains of any kind to speak of. If they were dead, there would at least be some kind of trace. And then there were all the questions raised by Pastor Bartholomew Jenner's strange sermons. Why did he seem so focused on enacting rituals? Did any of his methods really benefit the town? And why did he place so much emphasis on cicadas, of all things? Answers were few and far between. Although almost 6 decades after the Foundation discovered the desolate town of Darrington, a new development would come to light. To be more accurate, it was 56 years later. On the 11th of January 2017, a Foundation agent named Daniel Mitchell was patrolling the area that had formerly been Darrington, North Carolina, before the Foundation had demolished all traces of the town. By this point, the SCP Foundation had long thought that they had figured out exactly what SCP-3089 was. They had even encountered it emerging in a number of different forms in both 2007 and 2015. However, it was what Daniel Mitchell happened across during the routine monthly patrol that revealed the horrifying truth. At the outskirts of the area where the town had once been, a series of sinkholes had opened up at some point between the previous monthly check and this one in early 2017. And if you think that these sinkholes caused a disturbance in the earth and uncovered all the bodies of the former residents of Darrington, you'd be wrong. It was far, far stranger. The Foundation conducted a full-scale examination of the sinkholes around the demolished North Carolinian town. And these weren't just a few patches of loose ground that had sunk through. The geological survey the Foundation carried out quickly revealed that these sinkholes led to an extensive network of tunnels underground. They extended several hundred kilometers outwards, practically covering the entire underside of where Darrington had been. The tunnels seemed far too big than any other created by any natural means, but the entire network also appeared too rudimentary, too imperfect to have been carved using any modern excavation technology, like a large drill. Plus, if any equipment like that had been on site, the Foundation would have noticed, as they kept the area monitored. It was almost like something had been burrowing through the ground, only to eventually crawl back up to the surface, resulting in the sinkholes. What's more, the Foundation's geological tests suggested that the network of tunnels was almost 4 decades old. That would have placed the date of their creation about 10 years after the disappearance of everyone in Darrington. Naturally, the Foundation immediately launched a mission to explore more of the tunnels. Before even completing a full sweep of the underground space in its entirety, they had made another discovery. Contained within the tunnels was over a whole ton of organic material that had been mostly preserved without decomposing too much. The SCP Foundation began gathering samples for testing, finding most of this material to be severely desiccated dermis tissue. That is the dense layer of skin beneath the epidermis, and it had all been entirely dried out. But that wasn't all the testing uncovered. According to genetic analysis, the tissue had 2 distinct types of DNA present. The first being easily identified as human genetic material, which made sense. Despite the material lacking in moisture, the dermis tissue didn't match the skin of any other mammal. But then there was the other DNA present. Combined with the expected human DNA was the presence of something else that the Foundation researchers had quite some difficulty finding a match for. Eventually, they determined that this genetic material entangled with the human DNA belong to the Cicadata montana, better known as the New Forest cicada. Cicadas, again. Cicada DNA mixed with human DNA, discovered in a large network of underground tunnels, all beneath the same town where a pastor had his congregation crush cicada shells in their left hands during one of his sermons. 10 years before the sinkhole incident, the Foundation was alerted to a particular YouTube channel by the name of Kai Sanchez Positively Rich. On the surface, Kai was one of the many online grifters preaching about how easy it was to quickly achieve an obscene amount of wealth by simply believing in yourself. Usually, if not always, these types of people were trying to scam their audience of loyal subscribers into investing in some kind of illicit money-making scheme or any number of other cons, promising their followers easy money that never came. But Kai Sanchez's channel was slightly different, so much so that the Foundation had to contain his entire audience, deeming them to have been affected by SCP-3089. The video that caught the Foundation's attention was an hour-long upload from Kai, entitled 7 Secrets to Ascend the Ladder of Prosperity. There was that word again, prosperity. The same thing Pastor Jenner had promised his entire congregation in Darrington, and the similarities didn't end there. In his video, much like the pastor during his sermons, Kai Sanchez encouraged his audience to visualize their success in order to achieve it. He implied that the human consciousness could impact reality. For example, if his viewers just imagined themselves having a bigger bank account or looking more attractive, then these things would manifest themselves into the real world. One of Kai's secrets to ascend the ladder of prosperity was as follows.
Visualize your ascendance. Reimagine yourself as someone who can reach the top of that ladder. Shed your old identity, tear it off, throw it aside like dead skin. You won't need it, not where you're going.
The resemblance to Pastor Jenner's sermons was uncanny. Kai's video even encouraged that his audience leave scraps out to lure stray cats into their homes, and then, once they had one, to take a knife and, well, you remember what happened in Darrington. But Kai Sanchez made sure to specify,
remember to hold the knife with your left hand.
Another online community was tagged by the Foundation for similar teachings. This group of insular men were trying to apply the same methodology primarily to attract women. However, they also reasoned it could be used to improve their own financial status and physical stature, all done through visualizing and believing that doing so would make these things improve, that having faith would grant them prosperity. This disturbed community even tried to use bug rattlers to emit frequencies to aid in attracting women. Contained within these rattlers were the preserved remains of cicadas. Male cicadas have tymbals, structures on their outer shell that emit a loud hissing, chittering noise that they often use to find a mate after spending so much time dormant underground before burrowing up to the surface. And if you've been paying attention, you might be able to guess exactly where this is going. SCP-3089 is a phenomenon that occurs within communities of people who are seeking some form of prosperity. Whether that community be a town, a group of like-minded people online, or any other group of collected individuals. The particular type of prosperity these people are all seeking can be anything from spiritual enlightenment to financial success. The SCP Foundation does not yet quite understand exactly how SCP-3089 starts, only that the communities affected by it will attempt to achieve their chosen material success through the application of rituals, like visualizing what they hope to overcome and achieve, and practicing sacrifices. In short, these people have to believe these acts will grant them what they want. They need to be willing to go far enough to do unspeakable things. They need to have faith. Although what they don't realize is, some things can feed on that faith. They can harvest it. Before these communities realize the terrible things that they have done, or who exactly has tricked them into performing these rituals, they'll begin to undergo a horrific transformation process, known as SCP-3089-B. It begins in the chrysalis stage. Members of a community that have been affected by SCP-3089 will experience a declined state of metabolism, now classified as an instance of SCP-3089-A. Their brain activity, heart rate, and body temperature will all begin to lower. Over a period of between 3 and 6 hours, these people will then suffer a change to their epidermis, the outer layer of skin. It starts to harden until it has formed a dense, brittle substance, like a shell. Next comes the second stage of SCP-3089-B, metamorphosis. Internally, SCP-3089-A individuals will develop a number of tetromas, a type of germ cell tumor that can contain several different types of tissue, such as hair, muscle, and bone. During the next 2 or 3 weeks, these tumors will expand and dissolve the person's soft tissue. Then there's the final stage, emergence. An instance of SCP-3089-A will exit its dormant state that began in the initial stage. Once they have awoken, then something exits the outer epidermal shell. It will not communicate. Some will retain remnants of internal organs, such as eyes or lungs. However, these are vestigial, no longer serving any purpose. The brain functions deviate from any normal human patterns. Having completed the process, this thing will attempt to burrow down into the soil via any means at its disposal. An outer shell, digging into the soil. The tunnels underneath Darrington, the genetic material uncovered below. Dermis tissue with 2 types of DNA, a mix of human and cicada. There is something out there. It is preying on people's faith, their longing for prosperity. Then when these communities are presented with someone who can take advantage of that faith, like Pastor Jenner or Kai Sanchez, they find themselves encouraged to push their faith to its furthest limit. And then they are rewarded by becoming something else, something nightmarish. The question is, when they wake up and crawl back out from their tunnels, leaving a sinkhole in their wake, where do these cicada creatures go? They'd spend hours making the costume. The 2 young boys, let's call them Johnny and Max, had always been on the creative side. Sometimes they got teased for it at school, but they didn't care. As long as they had each other, they could handle anything. They were best friends. Maybe one day they'd build great things together out of concrete and steel, but for now they worked with cardboard. Prior projects had included building a rocket out of cardboard in Johnny's backyard, like the kind that put a man on the moon. They'd also made a box fort like no other, more a box castle really, the kind that would stand for 100 years, as long as it didn't rain, of course. But all of that felt like nothing compared to the tunnel monster. To these 2 young friends, it was a thing of beauty. A fully articulated cardboard monster costume meticulously cobbled together from boxes, masking tape, cardboard tubes for arms and legs, and a little twine to bring it all together. Frankenstein, Dracula, Freddy Krueger. Those silver screen phonies were nothing compared to the tunnel monster. They even cut out eye holes in the head and drew the scariest snarling mouth that they could write below. The making was over, and now they were ready to play. Johnny and Max took the costume down to one of their favorite places in town, the abandoned Brechter construction site. To many would seem like a strange and dangerous place for 2 young children to play, but for Johnny and Max, it was perfect. After all, they were the age where they had more imagination than sense. Max would be the one wearing the costume. Johnny helped him put it on piece by piece, using extra masking tape and twine where necessary to fasten all the pieces together. Little by little, Max became the tunnel monster. The transformation was complete, and it was finally time for the games to begin. Johnny ran, wielding a stick as a defensive weapon while Max gave chase. He could feel his own hot breath within the cardboard mask. It was oddly exhilarating. He gave a monstrous roar and charged after his friend, chasing him into the child-sized pipes of an unfinished water drainage system. It was more fun than anything they could have imagined. Max really got into his role. He lunged forwards, grabbing Johnny with his cardboard gauntlets and tried to drag him back into the tunnel, all while giving low, guttural growls. Johnny laughed and swatted at Max with his stick like a knight wielding a sword. They ran and crawled through the tunnels, the best of friends having the best of times, making the kind of memories that would last forever. And in that sense, they were right. Something they made that day would echo on forever, but it wouldn't be something they would look back upon fondly. If they weren't so busy running through the tunnels, Max and Johnny might have noticed that something was amiss. They might have seen that, even though it was only 3 p.m. on a summer's day, the sky was beginning to darken. It may not have saved them, but it might have given them time to prepare for what was coming. Max was still chasing Johnny down a pipe, still fully in character as the tunnel monster, his arms extended to grab his fleeing friend while Johnny tripped. Max stopped to help him up, but something was wrong. When Max helped Johnny stand up, Johnny instinctually pushed him away, as though it wasn't actually his friend anymore. Max stumbled backwards in shock and horror. He could feel something changing beneath the cardboard. He suddenly was in pain. This terrible pain. Like he was being pulled apart and put back together. He started to scream. It was a horrible sound like nails on a chalkboard. Johnny had to hold his ears as the screaming got louder and louder, but Max couldn't stop. He was hurting too much to stop. Johnny was crying. He didn't know what was happening, only that his friend was in terrible pain and that there was seemingly nothing he could do to stop it. Even Max didn't know much more than that, but he thought it might have something to do with the suit. It felt like it was full of fire ants, crawling and biting. It felt like his body was full of fire ants. He needed to take the suit off before it got any worse, but he couldn't. The suit wouldn't come off. He reached for the cardboard mask and tried to tug it off his head, but it wouldn't budge. He felt like he was tugging at the skin of his own face. He could suddenly feel everything that brushed against the cardboard, like it was connected to his nerve endings. The fear and the panic got worse and he kept screaming. It was a deafening, ear-splitting scream. He didn't know it, but anything electrical within a 200-meter radius was dying. TVs shut off, radios fizzled out, cars stopped running. Nobody who didn't work for the SCP Foundation would ever know why. It wasn't even 3:30 p.m., but the sky above looked black as midnight. Max was afraid, but all he could do was cling to the familiar. He lunged forwards and grabbed Johnny, pulling him into his trembling embrace. Is he still Max now? No, he doesn't think so anymore. He's something else entirely. As he held his friend, Max tried to dig his fingers into the mask and tear it off. They pierced through the cardboard, tearing holes into it. It was agonizing, but the mask stayed put. There was no escape. He closed his eyes just for a moment. Maybe it was a bad dream. Maybe he could make it disappear. But it didn't disappear. Only he did. Max was no more. There was only the tunnel monster. When Johnny woke up, he was disoriented and afraid. He was in complete darkness, but he could feel the old metal of a rusty railroad track beneath his feet. He didn't remember how he got there, and he didn't remember Max either. Not his face or even his name. But that's all right. Max didn't remember him either. When the terrified Johnny eventually found his way out of the old railway tunnel he'd somehow found himself in, he was rescued by emergency services and treated for dehydration. Because of the incredibly strange circumstances of his disappearance and reappearance over 4,000 kilometers away, it was only natural for the SCP Foundation to check in. But seeing as Johnny had no memory of where he was or who he was with prior to his mysterious teleportation, all they ever did was investigate the tunnel he'd appear in. Of course, they didn't find a thing. The case was closed shortly afterwards, written off as a kind of one-off spatial anomaly. Johnny was given amnestic treatment and reintegrated back into his normal life. He would never remember his encounter with the tunnel monster, but many would, for decades and decades to come. There would be stories and scattered witness accounts from all kinds of people. Maintenance workers doing electrical repairs on subway tunnels, sewer workers cleaning up blockages in pipes, road workers fixing the asphalt in underpasses. The challenge with being an SCP Foundation field agent is often separating the genuine leads from the urban legends and spooky stories. But the details here were all too similar and specific. After all, it would be such a strange thing to make up. A moldy old pile of cardboard boxes getting up and running towards you. But stranger still, these incidents and encounters were occurring all over the United States, with the only commonalities being that all of them happened in tunnels or tunnel-like structures. The Foundation didn't know if they were dealing with one entity or many. Another peculiar factor they observed was that sometimes people who had encounters with the tunnel monster then themselves appear in tunnels extremely far away from the ones in which they first encountered it. As far as the Foundation was aware, besides transporting them vast distances, it never actually harmed any of its victims. But according to one Boston sewer worker, Gus Zagrelia, when the tunnel monster laid its cardboard hand on him, he felt the most profound sense of paranoia and dread. He described it as feeling like 1,000 eyes in the dark, watching you die. Then he blinked and he woke up in an Arizona viaduct roughly 6 hours later. Everyone who reported a similar experience with the tunnel monster was detained, debriefed, and given amnestics by the Foundation. Eventually, they gathered enough data on prior encounters to accurately predict the next tunnel that the tunnel monster would manifest inside. A new mobile task force was formed to secure the creature, MTF New 4, also known as the Box Cutters. What they didn't expect was that when they finally engaged the beast, was that it was no larger than a human child. It wasn't some huge tunnel-dwelling nightmare, even after all these decades. The tunnel monster was little more than a frightened, lonely little boy. He growled, attempting and failing to come off as intimidating to these hardcore MTF members, and referred to himself as the tunnel monster. When they didn't react with fear and surprise like the others, he became subdued. They were able to peacefully apprehend him and take him back to Site-54 for testing and containment. Preliminary x-rays found that the cardboard costume hadn't just fused with the boy, it had completely transformed him. On the inside, he was filled with crude cardboard copies of all the major internal organs, with his blood vessels and nerve endings made out of colored pieces of string. They couldn't find any information on who the boy was, if he had ever been a boy at all, and he was given the designation SCP-3663. In order to find out more, one of the leading researchers on the SCP-3663 case, Researcher Doyle, decided to conduct an interview with the tunnel monster. It had been the only interview with the creature to date, due to the emotional distress it caused the creature. When asked about its identity, it replied with only the tunnel monster. When asked why it attacked and teleported people to different locations, the creature replied, "The tunnel monster captures people. That's me. I'm the tunnel monster. I capture people and take them into the tunnels where I live. In the tunnels, the pipes. I'm the tunnel monster." As the interview progressed, the tunnel monster became increasingly upset until it began weeping through its cardboard face, finally culminating with its crying out between sobs, "Please, I don't want to play anymore." SCP-3663 only feels comfortable in tunnels and will teleport away in distress if confined anywhere else. As such, its containment chamber is technically the maintenance tunnels underneath Site-54, where it seems to have made a home for itself. Occasionally, if it experiences fear, damage, or stress, it may de-manifest and appear in tunnels elsewhere. At that point, the box cutters are deployed to collect 3663 once again and bring him back to Site-54. So far, there has only been one major containment breach with SCP-3663, but it was a little more deadly than you might expect for a boy-sized creature made of cardboard. The tunnel monster escaped from the Site-54 tunnels and began wailing in pain. It went positively berserk, attacking surrounding staff and trashing parts of the facility. Anyone who heard the wails of the tunnel monster reported becoming extremely psychologically disturbed by them. During this 4-hour rampage, the monster also tried multiple times to destroy itself with various implements, but was unsuccessful. After SCP-3663 was recontained, 2 deceased members of personnel were recovered from the scene. Autopsies showed the cause of death was a buildup of paper residue and wood pulp in all of their major blood vessels, as well as sinuses, ear tubes, and the majority of the digestive and respiratory systems. A number of other staff members were found to have been affected to a lesser degree, but are expected to make full recoveries. What triggered this explosive and deadly outburst? Not even the tunnel monster itself knew the answer to this question. But we do. At exactly the same time, a 79-year-old man passed away from natural causes after what seemed like a thoroughly unremarkable life. That man's name was Johnny. An SCP Foundation researcher sits at a table inside of a standard containment cell. These are often dangerous places to be, especially when the SCP you're supposed to be studying is one that you can't see. The researcher is taking notes, unsure of exactly what is going to happen next. He can hear the sounds of knives scraping behind, of flesh sizzling and searing from high heat. He braces himself as a burst of heat hits the back of his head, as if a fireball has erupted. An object floats through the air and settles in front of him on the table. It's a plate of food, and it looks delicious. It may surprise you to learn that there is no rule that the SCP Foundation must deal exclusively with violent and vicious creatures. Not every SCP held in containment shares the same malevolence and contempt for humanity as SCP-682. or the world-ending threat posed by the likes of SCP-2317. Some, perhaps not many, but some, are benign and might even seem outwardly friendly, but you'd still be taking a huge risk to assume that anything contained by the SCP Foundation is completely harmless. Such is the case with SCP-5031. As per the Foundation's containment procedures, this quasi-humanoid, meaning it appears to have some vaguely human features, is held in an airtight cell that is regularly checked by Foundation personnel on a bi-weekly basis. SCP-5031 has no need for regular nutrition or regular interactions from staff. The trick with SCP-5031 is not being eaten by it, since though it doesn't need food, it does still hunt and consume anything it encounters, human or otherwise. Avoiding being eaten is hard enough with creatures that can actually be seen, but like so many other creatures the Foundation keeps contained, SCP-5031 has developed an almost perfect defense mechanism, which is when observed, it will literally cease to exist. Some might choose to refer to this as a quantum lock. However, it is worth noting that traces left by SCP-5031 still remain observable when the creature has temporarily disappeared. For example, trails of blood and scratch marks left behind by SCP-5031 still exist when the SCP itself does not. Naturally, this makes both avoiding the creature and capturing it using cameras difficult. However, when SCP-5031's existence ceases, it still casts a shadow. From this, researchers have been able to determine several of the creature's physical traits. Based on its silhouette, it has been deduced that SCP-5031 levitates about half a meter above ground level, sports an abnormally small necklace head atop an elongated torso, approximately 1.9 meters long, with 3 sets of spindly lower arms that branch outwards. Using these arms and its loosely hanging body, SCP-5031 will lower itself to hunt any human or animal that draws near to it, and uses the blade-like tail to cut up food. Perhaps the most interesting facet of SCP-5031 beyond its defensive capabilities and apparent physical attributes are the series of 9 tests conducted by senior researcher Stanley Huxtable. Appalled by the conditions that the creature was being kept in, Huxtable took over the role of HCL supervisor for SCP-5031. Having grown increasingly frustrated and empathetic towards the creature, listening to its screams from inside its iron containment unit, Huxtable devised a series of tests to introduce SCP-5031 to various different stimuli as a way to better understand the creature, and hopefully keep it contained in a way that didn't seem to cause so much suffering. It's worth remembering that the SCP Foundation makes its mission to be cold, not cruel, in performing their duties to protect normality, and many of the researchers and staff are just as capable of having empathy for creatures as you might for a stray animal at a shelter. The first of Huxtable's tests involved installing speakers in SCP-5031's cell, through which a variety of different ambient and popular pieces of music were played to see if they had any effect on reducing the creature's stress. By judging SCP-5031's stress levels based on how much it screamed when compared to normal, Huxtable was able to determine how to best use music to calm the creature. SCP-5031 seemed to convey higher levels of stress when listening to Morning Forest, Deep Grotto, and Seaside Paradise ambience, as well as the best of late 60s British rock band Jethro Tull. However, the best of Mozart, Enya, Kiss, and Ben Folds produced dramatically different results, decreasing SCP-5031's apparent stress. Following this test, senior researcher Huxtable compiled a playlist featuring SCP-5031's favorite music. Over time, the stress-reducing effects of music on SCP-5031 seemed to decrease, but keeping the playlist on shuffle seemed to keep the creature consistently calmer than it had been previously. The next test involved introducing inanimate objects into SCP-5031's enclosure to monitor its reactions and how its stress levels were affected. When a softball was thrown into the enclosure, SCP-5031 immediately sliced the ball in two with its tail in one swift motion. A similar result occurred when researchers threw the creature a basketball, which was quickly punctured and sliced open by SCP-5031's tail. Its stress levels first seemed to diminish when the creature was offered a bowling ball, which it rolled around the enclosure and then later knocked it against a second bowling ball. However, when one of the balls chipped, rendering it unable to roll properly, SCP-5031's stress increased dramatically until a replacement was offered. Researcher Huxtable noted that SCP-5031 seemed to possess a similar level of motor skills to an average human toddler, with similarly explosive emotional reactions to match. Next, when given the choice between two food sources at opposite ends of its enclosure, SCP-5031 seemed to gravitate towards higher quality food, most notably favored cooked rotisserie chickens over animal carcasses. It even chose this option over a live chicken, using its tail to cut its food into more manageable bite-sized portions, rather than ripping its meat with its hands or teeth like many of its fellow SCPs. Researcher Huxtable recorded these findings and highlighted that, even though SCP-5031 didn't need to eat in order to survive, providing the creature with food of a better quality marginally reduced its stress. Senior researcher Huxtable next attempted to test SCP-5031's coexistence with other living subjects, each time making sure that the creature had been adequately fed to avoid any unseemly incidents. First, a live chicken was introduced. SCP-5031 rolled its bowling ball at high speed towards the chicken, increasing both its and the chicken's stress levels, and inadvertently killing the chicken in the process. When a second chicken was introduced, SCP-5031 gently rolled a basketball towards it, but ceased any further engagement after the chicken squawked from being hit by the ball. Next to be introduced into the enclosure was a blindfolded D-Class staff member, who was instructed to sit down and roll the basketball towards SCP-5031. After doing so for several minutes, the creature began to approach the D-Class subject, who was instructed to remove their blindfold to cease the creature's existence and prevent any potentially deadly incidents. Finally, researcher Huxtable had another Class D engage in a game of catch with SCP-5031 while facing away from the creature. This test proceeded successfully, and senior researcher Huxtable remarked how SCP-5031's motor skills were improving, albeit gradually and with some gentle encouragement. Through Huxtable's tests, the creature was learning. The next test, focused on teaching SCP-5031 linguistic symbols, utilized LCD displays and buttons connected to a food dispenser. One display showed an image of a rock, and the other an image of a rotisserie chicken. After some brief probing, SCP-5031 was quickly able to understand that pressing the button under the correct display would dispense a rotisserie chicken for it to eat. The creature was later able to adapt when, the following day, the screen displays and materials dispensed were swapped, and then later set to swap at random intervals. When additional rock dispensing stations were introduced, this time displaying the word rock as opposed to an image, SCP-5031 was able to determine which station dispensed chicken through a process of elimination. Whenever the functions and displays were swapped, SCP-5031 would find whichever displayed the word chicken to receive its food. The final phase of this test presented SCP-5031 with a single station, displaying the word chicken, but with a button that would remain inactive unless the creature spelled out the same word with a collection of lettered blocks it was provided with. After some initial confusion and frustrations as to why the button would not dispense food when pressed, SCP-5031 was able to assemble the word correctly, not only activating the button and dispensing food, but proving to researcher Huxtable that the creature was capable of learning language. Huxtable continued to test the creature, encouraging it to spell words using lettered blocks as a method of communicating. By increasing SCP-5031's vocabulary and the amount of human interaction it received, senior researcher Huxtable observed that SCP-5031 was gradually learning to sing, albeit non-verbally, as well as to juggle with its 6 hands, and was even communicating its food preferences and dish pairings. Later, another Class D, D-52125, was introduced to SCP-5031's enclosure to aid in further testing. Through D-52125's instructions, the creature quickly learned to draw using crayons, and created artworks depicting itself, its newfound friend D-52125, researcher Huxtable, a cat, and a rotisserie chicken. SCP-5031's new creative side didn't stop there though, as the creature quickly learned to play chopsticks in only 2 days once a piano was introduced into the enclosure. SCP-5031 even managed to start creating its own original, admittedly crude, compositions. Next, a spice rack was placed inside the creature's cell, and D-52125 demonstrated how to season meat. This proved to be SCP-5031's new favorite hobby, as it spent the next 3 days experimenting with different combinations of foods and spices, using its letter blocks to request more garlic powder. Interestingly, the creature only created artwork or music when D-52125 was present, but seemed to thoroughly enjoy its experimentation with food when left alone. Following this development, senior researcher Huxtable devised a new test for SCP-5031, providing the creature with cooking utensils and using D-52125 to demonstrate. 5031 was shown how to prepare a variety of different dishes, from hamburgers and tacos to Mongolian beef, steak, clam chowder, and profiteroles. In addition to a small peanut allergy, this 8th test revealed SCP-5031 to be a phenomenal chef, possessing culinary skills far beyond the average person. The creature quickly and enthusiastically embraced its newfound talents, concocting its very own brand new recipes, with D-52125 even volunteering to be the first to taste test 5031's dishes. It was shortly after this test that SCP-5031 spoke its very first word. And it should come as no surprise that the word was salt. Naturally, senior researcher Huxtable was very proud of the progress the creature had made with its development. The final test almost seemed to be what the creature was born for. Over the course of 2 months, SCP-5031 was tasked with creating a full 3-course meal, which would then be served to Foundation staff for Thanksgiving. SCP-5031 not only rose to the task, but exceeded all of researcher Huxtable's expectations, creating a meal that even Gordon Ramsay would be hard-pressed to find fault with. The creature created a first course consisting of sweet potato miso soup seasoned with turmeric. Next came a beautiful duck confit, glazed luxuriously with apple cider, and topped generously with sweet cranberry compote, paired with a side of butternut squash gnocchi and served on a bed of kale seasoned with truffle salt. The grand finale of the exquisite meal was a spiced cassava pie for dessert, complemented with the finest French vanilla ice cream and a maple hazelnut syrup. And SCP-5031 didn't stop there. The creature also debuted one of its original musical compositions to complement the decadent meal it had created. As the staff enjoyed the food, SCP-5031 performed live from its enclosure the deeply moving Piano Concerto for 6 hands, to an overwhelmingly positive response from not only senior researcher Huxtable, but the entire Foundation staff. As a fitting end to the creature's tale, Huxtable reported that, during the Thanksgiving banquet it had created, SCP-5031's stress levels reduced entirely. New, kinder containment measures that would keep 5031 safer but also far more contented were submitted for approval. Perhaps some of you may find it refreshing to learn that SCP-5031 isn't simply just another malicious, malevolent monster that the Foundation has to keep under lock and key for the safety of the world. Instead, SCP-5031 is a gentle, if a little frightening at first, creature that just requires careful and considered guidance instead of a cold iron cage and around-the-clock armed guards. Through testing, senior researcher Stanley Huxtable and his fellow Foundation staff were not only able to help the creature develop, but also found what makes it tick, and not just for the purposes of containing it. Instead, it is hoped that SCP-5031's creativity and flair for culinary and musical masterpieces can continue to thrive and grow, under the proud watch of researcher Huxtable. On an ordinary day in 1991, a young man known by the initials JS went on a hike with 4 of his friends on the wooded outskirts of their small town. Everything seemed perfectly normal until JS began to feel a strange sense of familiarity, like he had been in this spot before. He couldn't shake this weird feeling, but thought nothing more of it. Little did he know that this was a sign of deadly things to come. Several hours after first experiencing that sense of deja vu, JS was found by the side of the road, covered in cuts and scratches, with his friends nowhere to be found. This is the story of SCP-939, an unforgettable monster that you'll never remember. There was no way for JS to know that the unsettling feeling he felt and the horrors that followed it were the result of an experiment conducted by the SCP Foundation, an experiment with deadly, unforeseen consequences. JS and his friends were exposed to a substance known only as AMN-C227 as part of a series of tests performed by the SCP Foundation, intended to determine the effectiveness of this substance as a deliberate amnestic. Dealing with as many mysterious, secret creatures and objects as they do,
The SCP Foundation has long needed a way to tamper with the memories of those exposed to the Foundation's various prisoners and test subjects. And when the Foundation discovered AMN-C227, it seemed like it might be perfect for this purpose. So where did AMN-C227 come from? Over a year before the incident with JS and his friends, the SCP Foundation captured SCP-939. SCP-939 is a species of endothermic predators that live and hunt in packs. They are designated Keter class and regarded as highly dangerous and hostile to human life. Native to caves, they have no eyes, translucent red skin, and stand at an average of 2.2 meters tall, with an average weight of 250 kilograms. They have 4 limbs, each ending in 3-fingered claws and a 4th opposable digit resembling a thumb. In addition to their sharp claws, their mouths are filled with red fang-like teeth that reach up to 6 centimeters in length. In place of their absent eyes, they have light-sensitive spots running along their backs, which are covered in spines believed to detect changes in air pressure and flow. In addition to their many other terrifying attributes, the internal anatomy of SCP-939 poses a biological mystery. These creatures have no circulatory system and no digestive tract. That's right, in spite of being predators seemingly acting on a need to feed, they have no stomach. Instead, when they eat, their food builds up in their respiratory system until its presence inhibits function, and then it is regurgitated. In spite of being a creature that should not, under any logical conditions, be able to live, SCP-939 continues to persist, and is even capable of giving birth to live young after a gestation period of 12 months. The SCP Foundation was able to study a litter of these young that were born in captivity in September of 1992, though the creatures remain just as much of a scientific mystery as they were upon first discovery. Everything about them seems to defy the logic of the natural world, which, to be fair, is really nothing new for the Foundation. The respiratory system of SCP-939 was found to exhale small traces of an airborne amnestic substance, given the name AMN-C227. This compound blocks the formation of memories for the duration of exposure to it, plus a 30-minute period following the exposure, give or take a few minutes. It is colorless, odorless, tasteless, and completely undetectable in the bloodstream after only 60 minutes. AMN-C227 was approved for use as a Class C amnestic by the SCP Foundation in 1990, following some initial tests. However, after one particular incident involving a young man and his friends, the official use of AMN-C227 was suspended. JS and 3 of his 4 friends were previously given a dose of AMN-C227, though the details of why they were given the amnestic has since been stricken from the record. Several months after being exposed to AMN-C227, JS and his friends went out on their ill-fated hiking trip. While hiking, JS was suddenly overcome with a sense of déjà vu. When he mentioned it to his friends, 3 of them agreed that they had felt it too. One of the group, another young man who had not been exposed to AMN-C227, was uncomfortable and decided to go home. JS and the remaining 3 members of the group made the choice to stay in the woods and try to determine what was triggering the unusual feeling of familiarity. As they got closer and closer to a large cave near the hiking trail, the sense of having been there before grew stronger and stronger. Armed with only one flashlight and a foolish curiosity, the 4 went inside the cave. They made their way deeper and deeper and deeper into the darkness, not knowing why they felt this way or what they might find inside. None of the group could explain just what felt so familiar, only that the further they made their way into the cave, the more pronounced the feeling became. It was getting late, and they knew they should have been afraid to venture so deep into a cave with only one light source and no knowledge of what lay inside. But still, they pressed on. One of the group remarked that they should turn back, but the others refused to listen. They wanted to know what they were getting close to, what was drawing them deeper and deeper into the cave. Unfortunately for them, they would get their answer. In the heart of the cave was a pack of SCP-939, waiting patiently for their prey to wander into their domain. There are no witnesses to account for what exactly happened to JS and his companions, but we can reasonably piece the events together from what happened after. Once the friends reached the heart of the cave, the creatures were on them in seconds, raking them with their sharp claws and biting with their fangs. SCP-939 are larger and stronger than most people, so it was probably not much of a fight. However, while his friends were being devoured, JS was somehow able to scramble out of the cave and make his way into the woods in search of help. under the influence of the AMC-227 that had built up in the cave from the presence of the pack of SCP-939, JS lost a large portion of his memory of the event. He found himself on the side of the highway late at night, seriously injured and his clothes ripped. An officer found him there and asked him to stay still and remain calm until an ambulance could arrive. JS was still in a panic and attempted to run away from the officer, begging to be released so that he could get away. He babbled incoherently about the color red, screaming over and over again about the red, though when prompted, he could not explain what the red he was screaming about referred to. His friends were not with him. Just as the officer managed to calm JS, the ambulance arrived. Its flashing red lights sent him into another frenzy, and he attempted to escape custody, claiming that the red lights were going to get him. The official police report described JS as perhaps being under the influence of a powerful hallucinogen, that he was just having a bad trip, but the SCP Foundation knew better. The Foundation conducted an interview with JS about his experience, and determined that SCP-939 was certainly involved. As part of their cover-up effort, they strongly implicated JS in the disappearance and the death of his friends. He was convicted of manslaughter, though the bodies of his friends were never found. It is rumored that the SCP Foundation hired him on a prison work release program, and that he now works as a member of the janitorial staff at one of the Foundation's facilities. This incident led to the suspension of the use of AMN-C227, as it revealed some vital and disturbing information about the compound's side effects. After the exposure to AMN-C227, a person who found themselves exposed to it again would experience a sense of familiarity and felt compelled to investigate the source of this feeling. Essentially, anyone treated with AMN-C227 are not made aware of the existence and danger of SCP-939 would become a perfect victim, primed to be attracted to dens of SCP-939. It is likely that this side effect is not a coincidence, but rather a deliberate hunting tactic designed to attract prey that had somehow managed to escape. With no memory of their attack at the hands of SCP-939, this previous intended prey would find themselves drawn to the same den or even a new one, not knowing that they were walking back into near certain death. While the SCP Foundation suspended the use of AMN-C227 as a Class C amnestic, they did recruit a team of SCP field operatives to take advantage of this side effect. This team of operatives were deliberately administered a dose of AMN-C227 and briefed on its effects, as well as the dangers of following the feeling of déjà vu should it surface in the field. These infected officers were essentially used as bloodhounds, relying on any sense of unusual familiarity to sniff out new dens of SCP-939 so they could be captured and contained by the Foundation. As far as we know, this operation is still ongoing today. However, now that the Foundation has a sufficient number of specimens to study, additional dens of SCP-939 that are discovered are ordered to be immediately destroyed. As for the SCP-939 still in captivity, they are contained in environmentally regulated and negatively pressured cells with walls of reinforced concrete. The doors to the cells are airtight to prevent the leakage of any AMN-C227. And any personnel that interact with one of the creatures is required to wear level C hazmat gear to avoid exposure and follow decontamination procedures upon exiting the cell. All SCP-939 have subdermal tracking devices implanted to find them in the event of escape. Only one SCP-939 has given birth in the time that the creatures have been in captivity. Strangely, SCP-939 young look indistinguishable from human infants and change their physical appearance at some yet unknown point as they age. If any more offspring are produced, they will immediately be separated from the parent and studied. All that we know is that they are found in caves in the woods outside of a small town. It could be any town, even yours. So, if you're ever out hiking and struck with a sudden feeling of déjà vu, don't investigate. Don't get curious. Just go home. It might just save your life.
Down in the depths of Facility 23, a group of scientists stand before a massive rumbling piece of machinery. They all hold their breath as the gigantic mechanism suddenly stops. It's eerily quiet for a moment before a door slides open. The scientists crane their necks to see inside, to see what the result of their great experiment was. These were some of the greatest minds in the SCP Foundation, but nothing could prepare them for what they had created. September 9th, 2008 was an unseasonably frosty day when Dr. Charles Gears, one of the SCP Foundation's most iconic scientists, parked his Honda Civic outside of what seemed like an innocuous government cold storage warehouse. He sipped his coffee and surveyed the building, which he, along with about 100 others in total, knew to be Site 19, Facility 23. Why was Dr. Gears, former director of all Euclid-level containment at Site 19, here today? Because official testing was about to begin on SCP-914. The Foundation had acquired the machine now known as SCP-914 some time ago, but only after its recent reclassification to 914 had it been relocated to Facility 23. It must have been important because the entirety of the facility was being repurposed for SCP-914 research. They were dealing with an immensely complicated piece of anomalous technology here, and the same question was on everybody's lips. What exactly does this thing do? Dr. Arthur Hackett, the facility director, had requested the cold, clinical assistance of Dr. Gears in providing the answer. Once he'd finished his morning coffee, Dr. Gears headed inside. The facility's security chief, Agent Alan Sedna, had been beefing up security at the building, and at least 2 mobile task force units were already on call in case anything happened. The first day of official testing is always a crapshoot. You might get a nice drink out of it, like with SCP-294, or you may get an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. You never really know. All Dr. Gears knew, as he walked up the granite steps to the main entrance, was that he was already feeling exhausted. When you've dealt with anomalous objects and entities for decades on end, the sense of wonder and mystery begins to wear off, only to be replaced with a kind of tedium any office worker knows all too well. Everyone knew that Dr. Gears was devoted to the job, perhaps more than anyone else, but he approached the job with an emotionless effect. You wouldn't know from looking at him if he was thinking about the deadly anomalous creature in the next room, or what he was going to have for lunch that day. The doctor passed through security and was briefed in the break room by Dr. Lucius Veritas, director of research at Site 19. He explained that the machine seemed to work in the absence of any power source. Its mechanical structure is similar to machinery from the Industrial Revolution, but it's exceedingly complex for something constructed in that time. Foundation analyses into the structure of the 914 machine have shown it to have as many as 8 million moving parts, and that might even be an incomplete estimate. Dr. Gears wore his trademark blank face as he listened, solemnly nodded, and asked to be shown the anomaly. He was led into Containment Chamber 109B by a pair of guards. According to all current Foundation tests, the machine doesn't appear to pose any active risk of containment breach or danger to the guards, earning it the rare safe designation. As a result, aside from guards stationed on site, containment procedures for 914 were minimal. Whether this designation would need to be changed after testing was something Dr. Gears would soon find out. SCP-914 was a truly impressive sight to behold, a giant clockwork mechanism taking up around 18 square feet, with an unfathomably complex combination of screw drives, belts, pulleys, springs, and gears. A less stoic researcher might see the humor in recruiting a Dr. Gears to test such a device, but comedy definitely wasn't one of Dr. Gears' specialties. He stared at the machine with a detached fascination, analyzing its vital components at a glance. Gears noted a large mainspring beneath a rudimentary selection panel. The panel is copper, with a large selection knob fixed to an arrow above a series of different options: rough, coarse, 1-to-1, fine, and very fine. There was also a large key below the selection panel, for the purposes of winding up the mainspring and initiating whatever procedure this machine was designed to enact. Next, Dr. Gears noticed 2 large booths connected to the machine by a pair of equally large copper tubes. The booth on the left labeled Intake, and the right labeled Output. Incredibly, Dr. Gears was able to immediately deduce the purpose of this machine. It was designed to enact some kind of transformative process on whatever was placed into the intake booth. But what kind of transformative process? That's exactly what Dr. Gears was here to find out. The experiment was simple. They would gather a series of samples, both inanimate objects and living tissue, and use them to explore the different permutations of the 914 machine's transformative abilities. This initial series of experiments were approved by O5 Command and the site director, and with the 47 researchers present in Facility 23 at his disposal, Dr. Gears commenced his research into SCP-914. To minimize risk, Dr. Gears decided the first test would be a simple kilogram of steel. On his orders, the steel was placed into the intake booth. With the doctor's approval, a junior researcher set the control panel setting to rough and began twisting the mainspring key, at which point the booth's doors closed and a small bell inside chimed. The machine began to rumble, its 8 million working pieces churning into life. It continued like this for around 10 minutes before falling silent, at which point the output booth opened. What had once been a single lump of steel weighing 1 kilogram was now an uneven pile of smaller lumps, with evidence of laser cutting. Dr. Gears made note of the fact that having lasers within such a machine is both anachronistic and anomalous, and that the rough setting appears to messily cleave the object placed within the intake booth into pieces. Dr. Gears also noted that it would be unwise to test any kind of explosive material on the rough setting, unless of course they wanted to destroy the building. The research continued. Dr. Gears used another 1 kilogram lump of steel to test the 1-to-1 feature. This time the result was far more peculiar. The output booth contained the exact same weight in steel screws. This result was sparking even greater connections in Dr. Gears' impressive analytical mind. Firstly, the 1-to-1 feature caused the 914 machine to transform the output into something different from, but similar to, the intake. And while this would require further testing, it appeared that the 914 machine, despite being anomalous, does still follow the laws of physics. Samples passed through the machine conserve their mass and would not be transmuted on an atomic level from one element to another. Next, Dr. Gears pushed another lump of steel through the machine on the fine setting. The result this time was a kilogram of steel carpet tacks. From this, Dr. Gears was able to ascertain that the fine feature improves the samples placed within the intake booth somewhat. However, things got even stranger when Gears performed the same experiment on the very fine setting. The output booth provided several unknown gases and a lump of unknown metal with anomalous qualities. Namely, it was resistant to heat up to 50,000 degrees, impossible to bend or break with any force, and was a perfect conductor of electricity. Dr. Gears suddenly realized his task here may be more interesting than he'd initially imagined. Was that a bit of a smile on his face that one researcher spotted? Surely not. This was the famous unflappable Dr. Gears after all. The doctor decided to take it up a notch and began to test more complex items in the 914 machine. He removed his own wristwatch and placed it into the input booth before setting the machine to course and letting her rip. Literally, in this case. When the output booth was opened, the watch had been painstakingly disassembled into its component parts, with no damage to said parts. Dr. Gears noted the coarse feature as a more mild version of the rough, in the sense that it was able to take an object apart without any kind of fundamental damage. He also made note of the fact he'd need to get himself a new watch. Dr. Gears then asked one of the researchers to surrender their cell phone for testing. While none were excited at the prospect of their phone getting eviscerated by a Clockwork behemoth, one of the researchers eventually surrendered their BlackBerry Curve to the doctor. He placed it into the intake booth on the 1-to-1 setting, and 10 minutes later, the output booth released a brand new Apple iPhone. Sadly for the researcher who donated his BlackBerry, he wasn't allowed to keep the new device. Naturally, Dr. Gears was interested in trying out the anomalous, very fine setting on a more complex object. Seeing as no other researchers were eager to hand over their personal effects, he took a Colt Python revolver from a member of security and ran that through the machine on very fine. The result was an extremely powerful energy weapon containing gamma radiation, which fired a beam capable of disintegrating anything in its path. While the weapon's power was immense, it was also too dangerous and unstable to be added to the Foundation's armory for general use. Having collected a wealth of data from more complex objects, Dr. Gears was eager to move to the next stage, live test subjects. While his fellow researchers had some reservations, the experiments pushed on, beginning with mice. A single white mouse was put into the intake booth on the 1-to-1 setting, and the machine was activated. The result 5 minutes later was an almost identical creature, save for the fact that it now had brown fur. Encouraged by the fact that the mouse survived the refinery process, Dr. Gears next applied for the use of 2 chimps in his SCP-914 experiments. The first chimp was run through the machine on the fine setting. The result was a chimp of human-level intelligence, who has since begun working for the Foundation under the alias Dr. Bobo. and the data from this test has been expunged from the official reports to protect Dr. Bobo's privacy. The second primate test, this time on Ruff, was not quite as positive. The chimp was dismembered, with the mutilated corpse showing evidence of cutting from high heat and crushing. Of course, everyone knew where these tests were eventually going. Dr. Gears requested 2 members of D-Class personnel for testing. The first was a 42-year-old Caucasian male weighing 108 kilograms and standing 185 centimeters tall. Dr. Gears ran him through SCP-914 on the 1-to-1 setting, resulting in a slightly taller Hispanic man with a slightly lower body weight. He immediately became severely confused and agitated, and attempted to attack the guards present, leading to his unfortunate termination by Foundation staff. It was on the final live test that tragedy truly struck. A 28-year-old Caucasian male was run through the machine on the highly anomalous Very Fine setting. The result was an utterly nightmarish creature. So horrifying that the majority of the details on its physical appearance have been expunged from the report. The creature made a sudden escape, breaching the relatively minor containment procedures intended for the inert SCP-914. This highly dangerous creature killed 8 guards, as well as 2 senior researchers upon emerging from the output booth. A special response team was dispatched to take the creature down, but that proved harder than expected. SCP-914 had massively improved upon the human original, especially when it came to its killing ability. Eventually, it was captured, but the special response team suffered injuries and memory loss as a result of the creature's anomalous powers. The creature was also severely wounded, and its blood caused corrosive damage to the plumbing in Facility 23. The creature expired from its injuries several hours later, turning into a cloud of blue ash that blinded a nearby research team. Dr. Gears would later comment that the experiments were ultimately still a success, in spite of some minor hiccups. Testing on the device continues to this day in an effort to understand the full potential of the machine. Though, for obvious reasons, biological testing on the machine has since been forbidden, without direct authorization from O5 Command. After all, if an already dangerous SCP was ever subjected to the Very Fine transformation setting, we could be dealing with something beyond our greatest nightmares. The fabric of our world is littered with strange doorways if you know where to look for them. Tears, portals, anomalies, all leading to places and planes beyond human imagining and understanding. And SCP-2317, otherwise known as a door to another world, certainly fits that description. Contained and kept at all times under the watch of armed guards, SCP-2317 appears to be a simple and unsuspecting wooden door in its frame. It hardly looks like it requires such extreme round-the-clock security, or needs a strange, secretive ritual that the Foundation performs, presumably to keep the door closed. But of course, sometimes the most interesting thing about a closed doorway isn't where it leads, it's what it keeps out. Even by the Foundation's already high standards, the requirements and regulations for personnel who are assigned to SCP-2317 seem oddly specific. Psychological testing is standard practice to work for the Foundation, but an additional hurdle that anyone has to clear before even getting to glimpse at this unassuming wooden door is having a score of at least 72 on the Milgram Obedience Examination. It is also mandatory that personnel assigned to maintaining it are both unmarried, with no children or next of kin, as well as an unwavering, unquestioning loyalty to the Foundation, pure devotion to its code and objectives. These may seem like strange requirements. After all, SCP-2317 is just a door, isn't it? Perhaps there's a reason that the Foundation keeps so much of the information about SCP-2317 buried deep under layers upon layers of security, with only the Overseer Council privy to the full details of its strange nature. Knowledge, as they say, is power, but maybe knowing too much about whatever is behind that door can prove deadly. Still, if SCP-2317 is a door to another world, an alternate dimension, or parallel reality, it must be safe enough to visit. After all, the Foundation has been sending personnel in there on a regular basis. Daily, in fact. According to the O5 Council, this is done as part of a procedure to maintain active containment of something lurking beyond that old wooden doorframe. But what could possibly warrant such constant maintenance and surveillance? In accordance with the Foundation's guidelines, all staff are required to rotate out of observing SCP-2317 after every 2 months, and spend the following 3rd month in full psychological counseling before they are permitted to return to the containment unit housing the door to another world. It was after one of these month-long periods of evaluation that a Foundation guard was informed that his security clearance has been raised to level 3, and that he'd been selected for the duty of carrying out 220 Calabasas. He knew the name instantly. This was the title given to the daily containment procedure that absolutely had to be carried out. The guard didn't question these orders. After all, he'd been selected precisely because of his loyalty to the Foundation. He did make one request to his commanding officer, however. He wanted to know what had happened to the last guard that had performed the procedure. "Didn't make it out of psychological evaluation," the officer replied. Not letting this affect his dedication, the guard was told to prepare for Procedure 220 Calabasas, along with a fellow member of Foundation security personnel. The guard was instructed to gather everything on a strange list. The first was a pre-selected member of Class D personnel, specifically a convicted murderer. Class D refers to disposable class personnel, expendable individuals recruited by the Foundation for the sole purpose of testing SCPs. Class Ds were usually prison inmates repurposed for SCP testing, and the one chosen for 220 Calabasas was no exception, serving multiple life sentences for murders, or at least that's what the guard had been told. A Foundation personnel member instructed him to refer to the Class Ds solely as the assistant from that point on. Next, the guard collected a live chicken, an obsidian-edged knife, a silver aspergillum and aspersorium, to be filled with 500 cc's of holy water that have been blessed by a priest of the Abrahamic faith, and finally, a 1 kiloton nuclear device, which according to instructions was only to be detonated in the unlikely event of a catastrophic containment failure. In other words, the last resort. After following his instructions to the letter and without question, the guard and his colleague were briefed. The Foundation personnel member informed them that he'd be joining and leading them in the procedure. The staff member also specified that henceforth he'd be referred to as the Celebrant until the completion of 220 Calabasas. The guard was acutely aware of how specific these instructions were, but trusted in the Foundation, knowing that if they wanted this procedure performed a certain way, then it was in everyone's best interest to carry out the orders to the letter. But what the Celebrant then went on to explain raised far more questions about SCP-2317 and the nature of Procedure 220 Calabasas. The Class D joining them wasn't actually a Class D. The assistant, as they were now referred to, was in reality another Foundation staff member, with a Level 4 security clearance specifically tailored to SCP-2317. Every member of staff entering through SCP-2317 and taking an active role in 22 Calabasas needed to be informed that this assistant was not to be harmed or treated as a member of disposable class. Fighting back the nagging question of why the Foundation would employ this subterfuge, the guard, along with his fellow security officer, the Celebrant, and assistant, prepared for their departure through the door to another world at solar noon, when the sun was highest over SCP-2317. Solar noon, chickens, and holy water. This all seemed like an oddly occult combination for the Foundation. As they entered the old wooden door, beyond lay a barren salt plain, stretching out for kilometers in every direction. This alternate dimension, according to the briefing, was designated SCP-2317 Prime. The guard immediately noticed a ring of 7 pillars directly ahead of the group as they entered, each of them bearing intricately detailed engravings unlike anything from any era of ancient history. Procedure 220 Calabasas was carried out quickly but carefully, the guard watching as the Celebrant and assistant were careful not to miss a step. First, the Celebrant scattered holy water into the center of the pillars with the aspergillum and aspersorium, looking down at his feet and keeping a steady pace as he stepped counterclockwise around them. The guard watched intently as the Celebrant completed his circuit around the pillars and turned to the assistant, anointing his head with holy water. 7 seals, 7 rings, 7 thrones for the Scarlet King, he said aloud. The assistant, with the obsidian blade in his hand, took the chicken and dispatched it in sacrifice, letting its blood mix with the holy water. He then repeated the celebrant's circuit in the opposite direction before stepping into the center of the stone pillars. "Blood for the old gods, water for the new king," the assistant recited, pouring the remaining mix of blood and holy water over a patch of salt in the middle of the 7 pillars. Even though he knew it wasn't his place to question the Foundation, as the 220 Calabasas procedure took place, the guard couldn't help but wonder what all this was for. It seems so ritualistic, like something deeply religious or even magical. He never bought into all that occult mumbo-jumbo, even while working for the Foundation. But he had learned not to question anything, even the strangest and most inexplicable of sights. Little did he know that beneath his feet was an ancient and unknowable horror, a beast chained and lying in wait. Contained in a chamber directly underneath the pillars sat an impossibly large creature. Humanoid and obese, its body covered entirely in scales thicker than armor plating. Branch-like horns protruded from its jawless head, pointing up to chains that hung from the 7 pillars above, each one hooked into the entity's back. All but one of the chains was broken, a final withering shackle keeping the Devourer of Worlds in its underground prison. Ever since 1894 BCE, when Erexian mystics imprisoned it, the Devourer has been waiting patiently for its inevitable freedom. It knows, as well as the Foundation, that nothing can be done to prevent the final chain from one day breaking. Even Procedure 220 Calabasas won't keep the creature contained. It's nothing more than a smokescreen, an act designed to create an illusion of active containment and maintain Foundation morale until a permanent solution can be devised to keep SCP-2317 imprisoned. Of course, if the guard had known this, it would have also explained the need for a 1-kiloton nuclear device as part of this staged ritual. Procedure 220 Calabasas had all the components to trick everyone below the O5 Council, emulating religious and occult rituals, the increased level of security surrounding the procedure and its purpose, and telling staff that any failure to correctly and completely perform the 220 Calabasas procedure will result in an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. All these elements work together to conceal the truth that one day the Devourer will escape and lay waste to our dimension. Knowledge is power, and maybe knowing too much truly is deadly. Perhaps if the guard had learned any of this, he'd have understood why his predecessor never made it out of psychological evaluation. Maybe if he had questioned the purpose of Procedure 220 Calabasas, he'd have learned the true nature of SCP-2317 and what that doorway kept out. But he was loyal to the Foundation through and through. As the team finished performing 220 Calabasas and returned through the wooden door, the guard took one last glance over his shoulder at the vast salt plain. The entire dimension was calm, silent, but not peaceful. It was patient. The entity had waited centuries for its time, and now all it would take was the breaking of this 7th and final chain. One day. The door was closed behind the guard as he, the celebrant, the assistant, and his fellow security officers stepped back through. Their work done and, as far as they knew, preventing catastrophe for another day. Only the Foundation higher-ups, the Overseer Council, are aware of the true danger posed by SCP-2317 and its sole inhabitant. Current predictions are that at some point within the next 30 years, the Devourer of Worlds will be freed. Any and all attempts to repair or recreate the chains holding it in place have so far failed. As such, the O5 Council has elected to continue providing Foundation personnel with the ignorant hope that Procedure 220 Calabasas is an effective strategy for containment. As we've said, sometimes the most interesting thing about a closed door isn't where it leads, it's what it keeps out. In the case of SCP-2317, the unassuming wooden door holds at bay an ancient creature of untold power that will one day break free and wreak havoc in our dimension. Nothing the Foundation does can prevent it, or keep it contained behind the door to another world. And only the Overseer Council knows that any and all efforts to do so are futile. With all that in mind, We can only hope that the doorway of SCP-2317 stays closed, at least for a little while longer. Mobile Task Force Edna-84, also known by the codename and thus upon his Crucible, is on one of the strangest missions they've ever been sent on. They sit in a darkened room, beads of sweat trickling down their brows. The lights of computer monitors shine upon their faces. They're tackling a monster that, if it escapes, will literally devour all of creation. It has no fear, it has no remorse, and if it isn't kept contained by Edna-84, it may escape and wreak havoc across the world. Oh, and did we mention it's trapped in a Minecraft server? You heard us right. SCP-4335 is a cognito-hazardous extra-dimensional being of pure terror, trapped inside a procedurally generated world in the immensely popular game Minecraft. You hear about a lot of horrifying monsters being described as Lovecraftian, but only this monster is Minecraftian. There's a lot that needs explaining here, and we intend to get to all of it. But let's start with how the Foundation keeps this truly exceptional beast contained. The Foundation first discovered SCP-4335 back in 2010, shortly after the alpha version of Minecraft was released. Because of the online nature of the game, it's proven to be impossible to contain 4335 externally, seeing as it isn't confined to any one physical location. Shutting off the server 4335 is found in is not an effective containment method either, as this just causes the entity to simply hop to a different server. The Foundation's greatest fear is that 4335 will one day make the leap out of Minecraft and cause chaos in our world. That's why it's imperative to draft containment procedures for SCP-4335 within the game. This led to the creation of a containment site unlike any other. Site M1, the first official Foundation site made entirely out of Minecraft blocks. Everyone who was originally involved in the server has been removed and amnesticized. Since then, elite SCP Foundation containment specialists and gamers have been constructing the perfect prison for SCP-4335. Site M1 is a large stone complex built into the side of a mountain. It has a number of key features, including a supply area filled with materials vital for 4335's continued containment, chests filled with books that contain SCP-4335's containment procedures, a few animal farms for the purpose of breeding and killing livestock for their meat, the entrance to a mine, several chests containing books specifically designed for civilians to learn about 4335 if they ever breach containment and enter the server, and of course, the actual containment chamber for SCP-4335 itself, which is a little more complicated. 4335's containment chamber is built out of several layers, all made from iron blocks. The outermost cube is 75 by 75 by 75 blocks. The inner cube is 55 by 55 by 55 blocks, and the innermost cube is 25 by 25 by 25 blocks, creating several levels of defense. Finally, one layer within all these others, which contains the anomaly proper, is made from obsidian blocks. SCP-4335 is bound into the center of the containment chamber with a complex mechanism. The outermost cube is completely filled with water, and several dispensers capable of rapidly dispensing large amounts of items in a short amount of time line the cube. The cube also contains several mob farms, which are devices that constantly spawn enemies into the chamber that drop loot when they die. The chamber is essentially designed to funnel a constant flow of items inwards to SCP-4335. There are even contingency measures for if SCP-4335 manages to breach containment. If escape is attempted, blocks of TNT detonate above the ceiling, causing lava to pour into the chamber. At that point, MTF Edna-84 are dispatched into the server to lure 4335 back into its containment chamber. To do this, they fire a mix of fire-resistant potions and ender pearls, which have teleportation capabilities. Interestingly, there's one more basic method of luring SCP-4335 back into the obsidian cube: taunting and insulting. One of SCP-4335's many anomalous abilities is being able to hear people through the screen, and being a proud creature, it often responds to insults by charging in to directly engage the insulter. If SCP-4335 still manages to breach the containment that has been set up for it, then they even expect that it will likely soon hop into another server. At that point, the goal will shift to finding the monster and recontaining it. With containment procedures this complex and extensive, it shouldn't come as a surprise that SCP-4335 rests firmly in the Keter class. What exactly is this anomalous entity? Why does its containment hinge on constantly providing it with items? And how did it end up in Mojang's popular building and survival game in the first place? SCP-4335, in terms of physical dimensions, appears almost identical to the player character, with an all-black skin. It also appears to be constantly shrouded in a cloud of smoke particles, and has long black tendrils protruding from its back. In some respects, 4335 has been compared to two popular creepypasta figures, Herobrine and the Slenderman. But 4335 is far stranger. Its physical body behaves similarly to most assets native to the game, with a few peculiar, anomalous abilities we'll discuss soon. Handling SCP-4335 is an extremely delicate process. If command blocks, creative mode, or server commands are ever enabled in a server with SCP-4335, the server will instantly shut down, and SCP-4335 will move to a different server. SCP-4335 also uses its tendrils to destroy surrounding blocks before consuming them. With each successful consumption, SCP-4335 grows, and when it reaches sufficient size, it hops to a different server. As you can see, keeping SCP-4335 contained is an uphill battle, but luckily there are two factors on the Foundation's side here. The first is that SCP-4335 is immobilized while consuming items and blocks, limiting its ability to actively escape Foundation forces. The second factor is that SCP-4335 needs a rest period between consuming blocks in order to grow, meaning if its consumption is constant and continuous, it isn't able to grow. These two factors have informed the entirety of the Foundation's containment procedures around SCP-4335. It's locked into its chamber and fed items and blocks constantly, effectively rooting it in place. When SCP-4335 begins to grow, the Foundation also found that the application of Ender Pearls helps reduce it back to its normal size. However, SCP-4335 does have a method of striking back against its captors. 4335 is a Virgin-class multisensory cognitohazard. Anyone viewing it without proper training and protection may experience distressing hallucinations. SCP-4335 is also capable of telepathic speech, with people playing on its server, and as we alluded to earlier, it can also hear any noises you make while playing. Weird is a term thrown around a lot when it comes to SCPs, considering it's pretty much a requirement for the Foundation to take interest in you. But an all-devouring Minecraft demon that can hear you talking through your screen is strange, even by Foundation standards. MTF Edna 84 first discovered SCP-4335 in the single-player server of Minecraft user Leaking Heart. 3 team members, Jason Yelsen, Richard Duchamp, and Shelia Freemason, covertly entered the game to investigate and potentially apprehend the creature. When Leaking Heart first discovered their presence on what he thought was a private server, he quickly left, a little creeped out by the sudden intrusion. Thankfully, the trio was still able to locate SCP-4335. They discovered the creature hiding inside a giant crater, as though it had impacted the Earth at considerable speed. Richard Duchamp, who was the leader of the team at the time, made the mistake of looking directly at the entity. In that moment, he experienced the full force of SCP-4335's cognitohazardous effects. He hallucinated, believing that his keyboard was melting before his eyes. In the aftermath of this incident, Duchamp was taken off the case, and Jason Yelsen was promoted to head of the project. Things were still going to get stranger. Yelsen was able to open a dialogue with the creature after containing it in a chamber filled with lava. It asked him whether it had landed in the right location, meaning our world, and Yelsen informed him that it had somehow fallen into the world of Minecraft instead. The creature was at first confused, and then angry and resentful about its situation. It vowed to find its way into our world somehow and obtain more sustenance. A few months after this, the entity managed to breach containment and hop into another server. Yeltsin and 2 others once again managed to track it down and recontain it. But this time, 2 civilians also inhabiting the server were exposed to the anomalous effects of SCP-4335. They weren't hurt, but they did appear strange and incoherent after experiencing 4335's cognito hazards. The Foundation tracked them down in the aftermath and gave them amnestic treatment. 4335 was contained shortly thereafter. Once again, Yeltsin came face to face with his new foe. 8 months after being captured, 4335 granted Yeltsin another interview from containment. 4335 admitted that it almost respected Yeltsin and the rest of the Foundation for figuring out how to capture and contain it so quickly. In exchange, it would give the Foundation something extremely valuable: information. First, it asked one question of Yeltsin: how does he define creation? Yeltsin replied, something that is built and brought into this universe by a sapient being using other things from this universe? 4335 agreed. It went on to explain that it came from a universe devoid of creation, a dark and unknowable place, filled with nothing but violent random chaos. Its dimension existed directly above ours, and it often looked down at us through a dimensional window, fascinated by all the creation below. It plotted and dreamed to one day infiltrate our reality, and Yeltsin finally had the opportunity to ask the magic question, why? Though he wasn't quite ready for the brutal honesty of SCP-4335's reply.
I do not like to lie, so I will tell you now. I wish to suck it dry of the toys of whatever force controls your universe. Destroy the light, destroy the earth, and destroy humanity. It reminded me of me, a blubbering mass of intelligence and order. It sickens me in ways I cannot comprehend. I hope you understand.
SCP-4335 was a connoisseur of creation, and it sought to devour all of it. In this moment, Yeltsin realized what an incredibly dangerous entity he was dealing with. The only mystery was why this creature had somehow landed in Minecraft instead of our world, which appeared to be the only thing that saved us. But Yeltsin didn't have time to think. 4335 was about to stage another daring escape attempt. One of its tendrils reached out and attacked Yeltsin's player character. In that moment, the real-life Yeltsin began to hallucinate and panic. Suddenly back in the game, a series of abnormally tall, slender black figures appeared and began deconstructing the containment chamber around SCP-4335. It had somehow summoned new minions into the game to assist in this containment breach. Jason Yeltsin entered cognito hazard quarantine following this incident and was removed from the project. And he wasn't the only one affected by this incident. Following the first appearance of these long, dark figures, players across the globe began to experience them appearing in their own games. The Foundation managed to find a solution. They contacted Mojang and had the creatures patched into the game during the next update, as a new non-anomalous entity, which seemed to stop 4335 from being able to use them as its own tools. They're now known as the Endermen, and are beloved among fans for being one of the creepier enemies. To this day, containment efforts continue for SCP-4335, but there's only one question left. Why did the entity fall into Minecraft rather than our world? The file posits the most likely answer, because 4335 defines creation as elements made by sapient beings. In Minecraft, the most popular game in the world at the height of 4335's power, everything that exists is the product of code made by humans. Creation is truly abundant there. As for our world, in SCP-4335's extra-dimensional eyes, there is no creation, no intelligent design, no soothing piano soundtrack, just frightening, chaotic randomness which is too unlike its own dimension. So even if SCP-4335 ever did arrive in our reality, it would likely be disappointed by how little there is to eat. Salvation, Indiana was your typical Midwestern American town. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, where everyone was comfortable leaving their doors unlocked at night, where there was a sense of trust between neighbors that you couldn't find in a more populated area. The The kind of place where word traveled fast and where people talked about things that were improper in hushed voices behind the backs of others. In Salvation, being an outsider or deviating from the norm was akin to complete isolation. You either fit in or you got out. And if you didn't, Salvation had its ways of making you conform to the mold. Gossip, organized stalking efforts, discrimination. These small-town methods were often employed by the town's inner circle to keep those who they had a distaste for in check. And unfortunately, this cliquish mentality can be the norm when it comes to small towns. There's nothing anomalous about the ugliness of human nature. But Salvation did have its secrets, the kind that, if brought to light, would tear a small town apart. The kind that attracted the attention of the US government's Unusual Incidents Unit, a branch of the Federal Bureau of Investigation that dealt with the paranormal and supernatural, the US government's answer to the SCP Foundation. Between June 18th and June 23, 1976, the town of Salvation, Indiana underwent swaths of extreme anomalous activity that affected the town's entire population, but was mainly centered around Salvation's high school, appropriately named, well, Salvation High School. 2 UIU agents were dispatched to Salvation to assess the reports of anomalous activity, record it, and of course help cover it up. This was one of the few times the UIU got the jump on an anomalous incident before a larger, more prominent organization such as the SCP Foundation or the Global Occult Coalition. Bet they got a company pizza party for that one. The operation went smoothly, with the agents using an early amnestic labeled Chemical 110 to wipe the memories of the townsfolk after interviewing them. Although in later years, study of Chemical 110 would prove it to be incredibly dangerous, as the amnestic was both toxic and had a degrading, damaging effect on human memory centers. Between this and the Foundation's early amnestic models also proving to be incredibly dangerous, the 1970s were an interesting time indeed in the field of supernatural cover-up operations. The timeline of events the agents established depicted an eerie scene. It was only a few days, but what occurred was both horrifying and strange. On Sunday night, 10th grade students at Salvation High School reported hearing what they described as someone trying to speak under the ground while passing by the school on their way home from a church service. One student reported it to her mother, who ignored it entirely. On Monday, an 11th grade student of Salvation High School claimed during gym class that he could hear voices coming from underneath the school's pool. Several other students corroborated this story. When school officials came to investigate, they didn't find anything unusual, but the UIU agents found that the lining of the bottom of the pool was cracked. On the same day, several female students reported seeing faceless things instead of their own reflections in a bathroom mirror. They did not seem bothered by this. During lunch announcements, many students described being able to hear a third voice alongside the 2 other students speaking unintelligibly below the broadcast. Curiously, the agents found that the PA room, where the broadcast originated from, sat in a media center near the pool. On Tuesday, students arriving at school noticed that the Indiana state flag was more than 3 meters above the top of the flagpole, attached to nothing, just floating. The American flag was not found, and more importantly, the students claimed they could see 9 female figures hanging by ropes from the flagpole, who disappeared immediately after being seen. During a biology class, one student suddenly stood up and rolled their eyes to the back of their head. They descended suddenly into the floor and disappeared entirely. Shortly after, they reappeared above a ceiling panel in the center of the room. No other students were able to identify the student, and several of their classmates insisted that their actions were just a joke. The UIU agents were unable to find proof of the student's existence in Salvation's enrollment records. Similarly, students described yet another student they didn't recognize walking the halls of the high school. They were unable to define any details of their appearance, save for one thing that stood out. They wore a purple satchel with the word syncope embroidered on the side. A custodian reported seeing something staring at him, standing at the bottom of the school pool. On Wednesday, the horror only sped up, as school staff noted that there was a full 2 inches of water across all levels of the school. For whatever reason, the school's principal decided not to close the school. At 7:56 a.m., the entirety of the student body heard an unknown voice whisper the word "hello" in their right ear. Members of the school band realized their instruments no longer produced any sound, but whenever they played, they reported seeing a small, black, human-shaped entity flickering in and out of view in the corner of the room, facing the wall. One student saw a dark figure walking up and away from the school through the air at an impossible angle. Eventually, the figure disappeared from her sight and was never seen again. No other student addressed this. On Thursday, a student in gym class avoided a dodgeball as it phased through his body. He sunk into the floor screaming for help. Nobody who noticed seemed motivated enough to help him. The entire school shifted roughly 1 foot off of its foundations at 11 a.m. The vice principal, who was sent to inspect the building's integrity, described seeing something small with too many faces grinning at him from underneath the building before the school inexplicably resettled back to its original position. The boys' locker rooms disappeared and were replaced with what witnesses described as something that screamed. They were unable to provide any details. As students left for the day, they saw 9 young women hanging in the air, tilted forward at an angle above the school's parking lot. They could be silently mouthing words, and their appearances were described by witnesses as ugly and unremarkable. They vanished, and again the majority of the town residents reported hearing a child's voice say the word "hello" below them upon the figure's disappearance. A panic ensued, as town officials had no explanation for these events. Salvation's principal made the call to close the school on Friday. However, when Friday morning arrived, the entire student body showed up for school. The building was locked, so the students simply waited outside to be let in. No individuals could describe why they were there. There was a knock on a window, and the students saw a small black entity standing outside of a second-story classroom. An entity phased in and out of the school's windows over and over until suddenly disappearing. After this, the front door unlocked itself, and the mass gathering of students entered the building. However, what they found was unlike the small school they had come to know over the years. Inside, Salvation High School was transformed into a non-Euclidean space, meaning that reality didn't work inside it the way it should. Hallways that led right instead led downward. Stairs that went up instead curved left. As the students moved through the school, they couldn't help but feel like they were always moving down, lower and lower. Some heard whispers, others heard drums in the distance. As they approached the basement, they saw a massive stone archway. Suddenly, the students shifted, encasing the entire group in rock and earth for 20 seconds. After this brief, suffocating torture ended, the students reappeared back in the school, except this time, every one of them reported being the only one in the building. They described the experience wandering the building alone before coming to what they called a doorway below a doorway, and ended up inside a small sub-basement room. There they saw 3 mysterious visions. A woman crouched over a body of water, surrounded and covered in blood. A farmhouse and a group of trees that were burning. 9 white humanoid figures floating in the air overhead. A weeping woman digging in a field until her hands began to rot and fall apart. When these visions subsided, the black entity reappeared again. It whispered hello, and the group of students were suddenly surrounded by 9 screaming female figures. After this, the students reappeared inside their own homes. It was at this point that the UIU began to enter the town to distribute amnestics to the subjects. More anomalous activity was recorded in rapid succession. Bodies hanging in the sky, water taps leaking human hair and mucus instead of water. Individuals reported that their facial features had disappeared entirely. Others reported seeing faceless creatures in the town. The black entity frantically appearing and reappearing in rapid succession throughout the town. Even a weeping young woman running back into the school's building, who witnesses lost after she entered the school's basement. The cover-up effort was brutal, but it worked. The townspeople of Salvation were convinced that they saw hallucinations as a result of toxic gases blown south from a factory up north. But what was the connection between all the phenomena? 9 faceless female entities, water, and blood. Something that literally upsets the entire foundation of Salvation High School. A small black entity. Adults in the town ignoring the things their children saw and acting indifferent toward them. All this sounds a lot like a dirty, dark secret being unearthed in the town of Salvation. Something people would rather turn a blind eye to and ignore. but they couldn't, because the terror was only getting started. A week after these events occurred, contractors assessing the damage to the school discovered the sub-basement room, where the students had various visions of anomalous entities. Behind it was the entrance that led to the large stone archway. This antechamber was discovered after one of the members of the contracting team slipped and fell beneath a collapsed section of wall and floor that led to the massive area underneath the school. The contracting team attempted to extract them, but they did not succeed. Their disappearance caught the attention of the SCP Foundation, who assessed the school and deemed the area beneath the school to be anomalous, as the building's architecture should not be able to accommodate the size of the area. It was designated SCP-3935, and as the Foundation began investigating it, they were determined to uncover the truth of what really was occurring in Salvation, Indiana. While exploring SCP-3935, they came across the stone archway, a piece of architecture whose origins are unknown. Inscribed on the arch was a phrase that read, "The way below winds deeper, longer, unspeakable its patterns laid, the lost forever damned to wander, this thing a quiet madness made." After the initial establishment of SCP-3935 as an anomalous location, the Foundation poured deeper into Salvation's mystery and came across the documents created by the UIU agents. The Foundation, being much more thorough in their containment methods than the UIU, decided that the small town of 1,400 people was easy enough to relocate entirely, and the entire area could be condemned, feeding into the excuse of a hazardous waste facility nearby, leaking noxious gases into the town's water and air supply. With the townsfolk successfully relocated, Salvation was quarantined and cut off from the rest of the world. Roads were removed and rerouted, and Foundation personnel turned over any trespassers to local authorities. Salvation High School became a hub for Foundation researchers studying SCP-3935 and the events that occurred in the town, and the building was heavily guarded when not in use by the organization. The initial exploration attempt into SCP-3935 was conducted by a team of Foundation agents, shortly after members of the contracting team were lost. There was a slight hope they could be recovered, and the effort was dubbed a search and rescue mission. 3 agents, Ellis, Porter, and Haskell, were tasked with entering SCP-3935, all equipped with recording equipment and a shoulder-mounted lamp system. They entered a cramped, narrow space beyond the archway, where the subterranean stone walls got tighter and tighter, and the air felt stuffy and uneasy. On the walls, images resembling a child's drawings were carved into the rock. As the teams continued to push through the rock tunnel, they found it difficult to breathe. The walls were getting narrower, too close for comfort. Suddenly, Porter's voice cut out, and his camera feed went black. When it came back, it appeared to be looking up at 2 sources of light, most likely the other 2 agents' lamps, as Porter fell from a great distance. His screaming was heard on both the cameras and by the other agents, but they couldn't figure out where he was. Ellis and Haskell began to panic, moving faster and attempting to struggle forward. The rock tunnel was so tight, so constraining, that they were unable to move more than a few steps in a second. After a short period of time, both men fell forward into a larger open space. As they searched for Porter, who wasn't behind them, they came to the conclusion that he must have fallen into a ravine or slipped beneath the rocks. There was no other explanation for how he disappeared so suddenly, but their talk was cut short when they realized what was in front of them. They hadn't noticed it at first, but when they turned their lamps forward, they noticed a gigantic structure, seemingly carved out of stone. It resembled Salvation High School almost perfectly. The main entrance was visible, and the windows too, a stone replica of the school, hidden in this massive underground area. The agents couldn't believe it. There was a thick layer of fog in front of them, but they could make out a narrow stone bridge that extended across a large chasm, leading to the stone replica of the school. As they examined further, they noticed that underneath the school was another model of the school, and under that one was another. It went on indefinitely, extending deeper and deeper into the ground, in the direction that all things in Salvation seemed to go, down. On the other side of the bridge, hanging mid-air, were 9 female entities, their faces obscured by long white hair. The 2 agents stood still in fear. After a short time, the figures appeared 10 meters backwards, and then another 10, and then they appeared right in front of the door of the stone school structure. Slowly, they lifted their heads, revealing their featureless faces to the agents, who recoiled in fear. After that, they disappeared. The two agents debated going back for reinforcements, but they pushed onward after hearing the sudden sound of many voices speaking in hushed tones in the distance. It could have been the lost contractors, or their lost man, Porter. They entered the stone school and began searching. Inside, they couldn't make heads or tails of the architecture. As they ran down the hallways, following the sound of the voices, they noticed that the halls seemed to stretch on forever, but they didn't seem to notice the watching, featureless faces who observed the agents from the window panes in the doorways. As the agents came to the auditorium doorway, Agent Haskell let out a scream, and his voice recorder disconnected. At this point, what occurred became nearly impossible to make out on the Foundation's recording. The voices grew louder. Haskell's camera shifted perspective to the floor. 9 female entities appeared around Agent Ellis, contorting their bodies into impossible positions. Haskell ran, but the entities pursued him. He screamed for help. Eventually, the figures hung in the air, unmoving. Haskell slowed down too and slowly turned around, coming face to face with a small black humanoid entity sitting upside down on the ceiling of the hallway. It whispered one word, "Hello." The feed cut out to the choppy sounds of audio distortion. A snapping noise was heard, and then silence. And then all 3 agents' feeds returned. For the duration of the exploration recording, Haskell, Ellis, and Porter lost their minds in the depths of SCP-3935. In between periods of silence, they laughed, screamed, and shouted incoherently, rambling on about how dark it is and how they can't go down any further, below, where it goes on forever, where they can be part of the 9, be a part of salvation, where they can fall forever. And after that, silence. The feed was cut out completely, and neither the trio nor the contractors were ever recovered. After this failed, horrifying exploration attempt, more anomalous activity occurred in the town during the Foundation's occupation. Sightings of the 9 faceless entities in the streets and the trees. An agent who saw the black figure constantly in his peripheral vision. Sounds coming from a grove of trees near the school, which led to a cabin and 9 corpses of former Salvation High School students in the backyard. But before they could investigate, the female entities appeared once more, and they were unable to locate the grove again. The Foundation's investigation of Salvation continued through the decades, interviewing former staff members of the school and residents. They were trying to piece together any semblance of a coherent story, to find a way to connect all these dissonant elements into something understandable. The black figure, the corpses, the buried secrets, and the 9 female entities. How did it all connect to the school? In 2002, a Foundation agent interviewed Mrs. Fletcher, an English teacher at Salvation High School during the period of anomalous activity in 1976. The interview started out ordinarily enough. Fletcher, in her old age, couldn't remember much. She remembered the town was quiet, with a tight-knit community. They didn't even need a police force because there was so little crime. She remembered students would go into the woods and chase ghosts, or claim they saw things, but it was never anything too strange. But as Fletcher continued to talk, she let her mind wander more and more. She recounted how there was a disappearance at the high school, a girl who was last seen by the school's pool. The town assumed she ran away. After all, there were some individuals who held strong opinions in Salvation, the kind of opinions that didn't sit right with some of the younger residents. The church was important in Salvation. Nearly everyone went. Fletcher opened up some more. There was a scandal, she recalled. A teenage girl on the school cheer team who ended up pregnant out of wedlock. She couldn't recall her name or what she looked like, but she remembered the town's inner circle was in an uproar about it. She didn't want them to know. She didn't want anyone to know. It was a secret she could barely keep from spreading. It must have been destroying her, Fletcher explained. She couldn't remember much about the girl, but she did remember that the girl would always say hello to her. Too many times, in fact. Eventually, the girl was found hanging in the woods, right outside of a log cabin. They found a note in her hand, which contained a drawing of a building that resembled the high school, and on its back, the repetition of the same word over and over again. But Fletcher couldn't recall what the word was. The Foundation agent was about to close the interview out, but he had one last thing to ask. He produced a picture of the unidentified 9 female figures that were haunting the town and showed it to Fletcher. She became noticeably pale and short of breath. "Do you know anything about this, Mrs. Fletcher?" the agent said. She collected herself and examined the image as best as she could, her hand shaking.
"Why, yes I do. Those are, the cheerleaders. They were, well, let me think. There were 10 of them, though, I think. Unless something happened to one of them, there were definitely 10.
The Foundation didn't have to ask what happened to the 10th. 1835. The American Frontier. A beacon of hope in a world choked with blood and smog. Little did the hopeful citizens of a still newly independent United States know. The evils of the old world had followed them here. Sometimes it took the form of hate, of violence, of desperation and starvation. But sometimes pure evil wasn't just some abstract concept existing in and around all of us. Sometimes that evil, that pure cruelty, malice, and greed, walks in the shape of a man. One such man was James Anderson, an unremarkable name for a truly exceptional man. Exceptional in the sense that if most human beings aren't willing to sell out all of humanity for their own petty gain, James Anderson is definitely the exception. After all, it's by his design that we have SCP-001, the anomaly that set the SCP Foundation and our entire reality down its current path. Of course, you know the deal with SCP-001. Not one anomaly, but many. A collective designation for a vast number of entries, all of which spell beginnings or ends for the SCP Foundation and sometimes even our universe. Scarlet Kings, Howling Black Moons, Ouroboros Cycles, and Gate Guardians. You've heard them all and seen the files. But unlike all the others, there is no file for the factory. That's because the full story only exists in the mind of O5-1, one of the most powerful and arguably the oldest member of the SCP Foundation. He'll die before he ever commits the story to paper. Some memories are just too awful to record. Their details and implications are too painful to ever subject others to. SCP-001 isn't just about Anderson and his atrocities. It's about all the terrible nightmares that unfolded afterward, and the deal with the devil that O5-1 struck to lock them away. For now, at least. But it all begins with James Anderson. His family had become incredibly wealthy in the Revolutionary War, and in the decades since, his fortune had only multiplied, as fortunes tend to do. In the early 1800s, he began work on his beautiful and horrific magnum opus, the Anderson Factory. It would be the pinnacle of the Industrial Revolution, the manufacturing plant to end all manufacturing plants. 3 stories tall and a mile wide. Company towns had existed for a long time, but this time, the factory itself was the town. It had everything a worker would ever need. They would live, sleep, play, and most importantly of all, work in the same place. They would never need to leave. All their wants and needs from cradle to grave would be met in the Anderson factory, and all that Mr. Anderson ever asked in return was loyalty and service. Was that really so much to ask from those whom he gave everything? It may sound like a horrifying form of indentured servitude to us, but to the people in the United States in the early 1830s, this kind of security and stability was a godsend. To many itinerant workers and unstable families across the plains, James Anderson seemed like a saint. Little did they know, his plans for the factory and them were anything but saintly. Nobody knows exactly what type of dark magic James Anderson devoted himself to. Many have theorized as to whether it was Satan he worshipped, ancient pagan deities, or something older and more powerful than both. In actuality, the only thing that James Anderson really worshipped was himself, and the pursuit of more material wealth and power over his fellow man. Any pacts he made with evil, timeless gods were just means to an end. The Anderson factory was a citadel to one man's cruelty and corruption, and every element of the building's design seemed to reflect that. Groups of 8 were forced into rooms together like battery-farmed chickens to maximize cost efficiency. People worked day and night in shifts of 3. Machines always rumbled and roared and chewed. When workers died in factory accidents and their blood spilled on the ground, it seemed to reveal arcane symbols carved into the stonework. These symbols were only visible when blood flowed across them. While people traveled hundreds of miles to live and work at the Anderson factory, they had no idea that they were working towards slavery, subjugation, and death under Anderson's iron will. And in some cases, fates much, much worse. The factory remained in operation like this for 40 years, while Anderson himself enjoyed a positive public reputation as a groundbreaking industrialist. How Anderson got away with his crimes for so long is sadly a tale as old as time. The factory made valuable products and an awful lot of profit. So, no matter how many rumors swirled about inhumane practices or arcane rites going on in the Anderson factory, nothing was ever done. It was just too inconvenient to ever reckon with the horrible truth underneath the productive surface. And it was truly productive. The factory was so huge and filled with such a multitude of enslaved workers, there wasn't anything they didn't produce. From textiles to technology to crops and meat, the machines were always on. The furnaces always burned. Anderson himself seemed obsessed with 2 things: efficiency and misanthropy, the contempt and hatred for humanity itself. He believed his workers were lower than him. They only existed as a means to his nightmarish ends. And if ever the workers became too injured to work, well, that doesn't mean that Anderson wouldn't still find ways to put them to good use. The lucky ones, starved and neglected or broken by the stress of work or the grinding gears of the machines, were used as material in the production of products. Some were drained of blood so that they could be used in the forging of metal. Others were ground up into meat slurry and used to pad out the beef, making it go further. People all across the country enjoying fine Anderson brand steaks had no idea that they were actually dining on human flesh the whole time. But as we said, the ones who ended up being cooked into steaks and hamburgers after death were the lucky ones, because at least they got to die. The truly unlucky injured workers became the subject of James Anderson's horrific occult experiments. Using a mix of twisted science and black magic, he turned men into abominations, powerful, terrifying monsters stronger and more deadly than any mortal man. Anderson was building himself an anomalous army, but it wasn't just monsters. There were just as many so-called normal humans helping him rule over the Anderson factory with an iron fist. They were vicious sadists themselves, spurred on by absolute loyalty to their immoral master. It was only after the Civil War that someone finally escaped the Anderson factory and confirmed that not only were the most horrific rumors about the place true, but they didn't even come close to covering the totality of what was going on there. When President Grant heard the reports, he was disgusted. As far as he was concerned, the atrocities of James Anderson should not be allowed to go on a minute longer. The directive was simple: find the factory, free its prisoners, and put James Anderson to death for his crimes. And thankfully, President Grant had the perfect group of operatives for the job. They were an elite unit of around 150 soldiers who performed a number of dangerous missions beyond enemy lines down south. Espionage, assassination, psychological warfare. But these missions weren't just against the Confederates. Some of the enemies they faced down south were things that could not be explained. The strange, the frightening, the anomalous. And the highest-ranking soldier in this unit was a man who would one day become the legendary 05-1. He and his men made their long and treacherous journey to the factory, a trip that would change all of their lives forever. When they first reached their destination, they first had to deal with Anderson's security force. These were men whose cruelty and loyalty to Anderson far outweighed their skill in combat. While they may have felt powerful when tormenting starving, injured factory workers, they were quickly routed and slaughtered by O5-1 and his team. When they ventured inside the factory, they were utterly appalled by what they saw. The inhuman conditions faced by Anderson's thousands of victims drove them into a blood-curdling, murderous rage. Almost half of O5-1's men were lost in the battle against Anderson's army of engineered monsters, but in the end, they prevailed. Nothing would stop them in their quest for liberation and vengeance on behalf of all that this terrible place had tormented. They fought their way to Anderson's office, where they found him cowering under his desk. For a man as despicable as Anderson, only a truly medieval execution would suffice. O5-1 and his men hanged, drew, and quartered Anderson over a period of 2 days. The sadistic madman died laughing in the end, saying that while they may kill him, his factory will never die. But the factory was no longer his. In addition to the factory's horrors, O5-1 and his men also discovered its wonders. It wasn't just normal items and monsters that the factory produced. They were also thanks to some of Anderson's arcane deals, the world's leading producer of anomalous items. Skeletal horses that never tire, shadow cloaks that could transport the wearer to different dimensions, toy guns that fire real bullets, even yo-yos that could flay the skin from anyone they touched. These were anomalous objects that could shift the balance of global power, items that could give them an advantage against the things that go bump in the night. While others among them were greedy or fearful, the inner circle of O5-1 were united in a singular purpose. Using the anomalous, they can control to contain the anomalous that they can't. This group took over the factory, making it Site Alpha, their first ever containment facility, and came to be known as the O5 Council. With funding that came from a mix of blackmail and friends in high places, this organization, a burgeoning SCP Foundation, grew more and more powerful over the ensuing decades. The tools they gained from the factory were pivotal in the continued success of their mission, and as they discovered more anomalies, they also put these anomalies to good use. But in 1911, O5-1 and his new organization came up against an enemy that even the factory's tools couldn't help them defeat. A warrior race known as the Fae, so named because their only weakness seemed to be a vulnerability to iron. But these beings were an order of magnitude more powerful than humans, or the beasts they'd once faced in Anderson's factory. The Fae handed them defeat after defeat, but soon humiliation became decimation when an army of the Fae led an assault on the factory. It was a day that only O5-1 remembered. The Fae slaughtered everyone, every guard, every researcher, every member of the O5 Council. They swept through the factory like a plague of locusts, leaving only death and destruction in their wake. Only O5-1 escaped and survived, and that's only because he ran. As he fled from the fairy forces through the halls of the factory, he came upon a door he'd never seen before, a huge golden door covered in Aramaic script. He fled inside, entering the very heart of the factory. Inside, he saw the floating dead body of James Anderson, bathed in red light. Now he was little more than the mouthpiece of the factory itself, or rather the great and unknowable powers working behind it. The factory gave O5-1 an offer, just like the offer it had given Anderson before. It would give them the power to turn back time and destroy the Fae, saving everyone that they'd slain in the factory. But in exchange, all of them would forever belong to the factory. And in a moment of weakness and fear, O5-1 took the deal. The clock was turned back to before the battle. This time, O5-1 and his compatriots, all of whom except him had no idea what had happened, had the horrific weapons required to slaughter the Fae. Weapons that nobody, mortal or otherwise, could possess. They repelled the invading force easily, but knowing the horrors that came before, O5-1 refused to stop there. With the power of the Foundation and the factory behind him, he hunted down and murdered every last fairy, driving their species entirely into extinction. As far as O5-1 was concerned, it was them or him. But with the Fae utterly destroyed and the Foundation's superiority assured, a shadow was laying over O5-1. He'd made a deal with the factory, and someday it would want its pound of flesh. 05-1, rather than facing the consequences of his actions, decided to run and hide. He had the factory decommissioned and buried under the rubble, never to be used as an active Foundation base again. But just because they were done with the factory doesn't mean that the factory was done with them. One day a toy gun appeared on 05-1's desk, a toy gun that fired real bullets, just like the ones they found in the factory a century before. The factory was still waiting for its repayment. With every anomalous item from the factory that the Foundation used, the terrible place only grew in its power. Since the resurgence, 05-1 has been sending the factory sacrifices, D-classes, dead and alive, as well as agents and researchers. But as time goes on, it seems that these sacrifices aren't satisfying the factory anymore. It wants more than 05-1 can ever stand to give it. And when 05-1 refuses to give, the factory will begin to take. And what the factory wants, sooner or later, the factory will get. Agent Kister was running for his life. Every breath had burned in his throat, like inhaling chlorine gas. He sped through the dark, surrounded by deafening metallic screams that bounced off the eternity of pipes scaling and strangling the walls around him. As far as he was concerned, this was what hell looked like. A nightmare boiler room that would somehow be less scary if Freddy Krueger was there, because at least there'd be some kind of recognizably human intelligence to reason with. The pipes, SCP-015, are truly unknowable. As an SCP Foundation Mobile Task Force member, Agent Kister had seen some truly horrific things in the line of duty. He'd been there during SCP-682 containment breaches, firing an assault rifle at the beast as its scales hardened into a bulletproof carapace. He'd seen the femur breaker used on some poor, godforsaken D-class to lure Uncle Larry back into the containment chamber for some midnight fun. In the most anxiety-inducing mission of his life, he'd once even bagged 096's weeping face after it slaughtered a whole mountain village. And these damn pipes were going to be the thing that killed him. He turned a sharp corner, trying to block out the screams of his teammates. 4 of them had been sent in. The rest were already dead, or worse. Stupid, stupid, stupid. They'd made a classic military mistake, underestimating the capabilities of their enemy. And in Agent Kister's experience, this had always been a capital offense. All to install that machine. That stupid little remote control reconnaissance vehicle. That's what they'd given their lives for. Agent Kister tried to blink away the memory of Agent Montgomery's face. Monty was the youngest member of the team, 28 years old, his first major mission into the heart of a skip. Kister wanted to remember him how he'd first seen him, a bright-eyed greenhorn, ready to protect the human race from the horrors that lay in the dark. But he'd been the first to go when everything got FUBAR. It was the smaller pipes that got Monty. 4 of them shot out, spearing his lungs and heart, pinning him in place. Even if they tried to cut him out, he would have been a goner. He coughed up blood and went ghost white faster than you'd ever imagine. Kister would never forget, for what little time he had left to live, the horrible sight of the light leaving that kid's eyes. And all this because one of them had tripped on one of the pipes on the way out and busted it. The mission was already done. What an awful, pointless way to die. Kister was yanked from his aching thoughts by a sudden obstacle in the way. A huge, towering pipe that looked like a pillar of flesh, covered in bulbous, staring eyes. The thought crossed his mind. Jesus, these pipes can really be made out of anything. He looked down and saw a series of rubber pipes slithering towards his feet along the ground like snakes. It was time to run again, but how long could you even run for when the very location around you wants you dead? They should have sent the mole rats for a job like this. The infinitely reconfiguring pipes changed the layout of the warehouse around him, making escape seem all the more unfeasible. That's when he started thinking about the terrible thing that happened to Agent Green. When 015 turned hostile, they needed to make a run for it fast. It wasn't unlike being a pathogen inside a living body. You start to make trouble, and the body's immune system is going to come for you. And one of the most common mechanisms for a body fighting a virus is a fever, a sudden increase in temperature that burns out the threat. The group turned and ran as the pipes started twisting towards them. Agent Green panicked and began striking at the pipes around him with his hands. The first instinct would have been to shoot, but no guns were permitted inside the SCP-015 warehouse. It reacted severely to any kind of tool being brought into its proximity. Several dead agents and researchers could tell you all about this if they hadn't made that same mistake. But when things were already going sideways, it left them defenseless. Agent Green was soon boxed in, caged by a latticework of pipes in varying sizes. He tried desperately to push them out of the way and make an escape route, but the hissing noise was getting louder and louder as the pipes started to turn a glowing red all around him. After all, when a body needs to deal with a hostile foreign object, it burns out the threat. Kister wished he could shake the awful high-pitched wail that Agent Green made while the heat inside his pipe cage became unbearable. It was like seeing a human get caught inside a giant bug zapper. His skin went black and charred, and soon after, the heat had risen to such an insane degree that Agent Green was reduced to little more than ash in his pipe furnace. But Kister couldn't afford to dwell. He kept running, vaulting over a long, ragged pipe made from stinking human hair. This terrible place stank of motor oil, mold, and death. But maybe those perceptions had been colored by the terrible things he'd seen here. There it was again, that awful choked screaming coming from inside the pipes. Agent Boggs. It was a nightmare to hear him shriek like that. Boggs had been one of the toughest men that Kister had ever met. He mentored him, back when he first became an MTF member. Having Boggs on the team meant experience. It meant safety. It meant that things would go okay. Kister had seen Boggs stare down some of the most horrifying skips imaginable and not even flinch. And yet, here he was, screaming and bawling like a hurt child in the pipes. Boggs was the next one to get taken. As he and Kister ran through the dark, trying to find a way out, they'd passed a huge pipe made of a soft foam-like substance. A seam in the side of the pipe had yawned open, and a tangle of writhing tentacles, each one barbed with thorns like the stem of a rosebush. They enveloped Agent Boggs, cutting into his weathered skin. He gasped in pain, unable to scream. It happened so fast. Before Kister even had a chance to grab him, he was pulled into the pipe, and the crevice sealed behind him. And that was when the screaming really started for poor Agent Boggs. Kister hoped for his sake that he would die sometime soon. Shrouded in the fog of his dark thoughts, Agent Kister turned a corner and felt cold, hard metal suddenly collide with his face, breaking his nose with an unpleasant crunch. He'd been clotheslined by a low pipe that hadn't been there before, and now he was laid out on his back, face humming with pain. Thoughts and feelings swam. He looked up into the seemingly infinite web of pipes weaving through the air above him. He was right earlier. He just knew it. The place was hell. It'd be his eternal resting place. Suddenly, a new, huge shape moved into the space above him. A pipe of ancient, rusty iron that looked older than even the warehouse holding this whole mess. Right above him, there was a huge valve fixed into the pipe's belly. He watched helpless as the valve opened itself with a squeal, and a huge dark mass came pouring out of it onto his body. A sudden weight, a sudden warmth, sound and movement, and tiny scratching claws. Rats. Thousands of big, hungry black rats with gnarled yellow teeth. Clumps of fur purged from their skin by mange. Big, ropey, worm-like tails swaying and whipping at the air. Who knows how long they'd been in that pipe? Who knows when these rats had eaten anything that wasn't their brothers and sisters? And here was Agent Kister, given unto them by the glorious pipes. The last thing he ever saw were those nasty yellow teeth, because they ate his eyes first. Word of the four disappeared, and presumed dead operatives soon reached Dr. Charles Ogden Gears, the legendarily taciturn senior researcher that managed the SCP-015 project, among a myriad of others. His face didn't betray a flicker of emotion when he was informed about the men lost to SCP-015. It wasn't that he didn't feel for them, more that he deemed it both unproductive and unprofessional to dwell on the deaths of personnel when carrying out their duties. After all, being killed by an anomaly was simply an occupational hazard, and a generous stipend would be sent to their families to compensate for their tragic loss. Dr. Gears simply asked, "Was the mission successful in spite of the casualties?" Did the team manage to install the modular robotic vehicle at the epicenter? He was told that the MRV had been successfully installed at least. Dr. Gears nodded and began scheduling a second exploratory mission for a few months in the future to check the status of the machine. Still, in the meantime, the MRV would chug along, doing what humans couldn't, or perhaps shouldn't, do within the nightmarish mess of ever-growing pipes. It would roll through, collecting information on everything around it, hopefully giving the SCP Foundation an inroad to mapping the whole thing, without needing to send a cavalcade of staff into the danger zone, just to discover more about these peculiar pipes. Sure, some lives were lost getting in there, but this measure would likely save even more lives in the long run. That was until something went wrong. The exact nature of what happened to the MRV inside the domain of pipes was a mystery, but it wasn't doing its intended job, and the SCP Foundation needed to find out why. The second exploratory mission was required much sooner than they'd initially anticipated, with a dual purpose: collecting the readings and finding out what exactly had happened to the MRV in the first place. He included a more specific set of instructions for the next mission. Only 3 members of personnel to enter SCP-015 this time, to minimize potential loss. 1 trained technician to collect and read the diagnostics, and 2 guards to maintain discipline and safety under pressure. With a setup like that, what could possibly go wrong? Dr. Gears' various assistants began headhunting the perfect team for the job. Junior researcher Lon, wanting to prove herself and climb up the ranks, put her name forward. She was young, intelligent, and had the initiative to get the job done. Though there was one thing that she hadn't disclosed when she was applying for this important new position. Junior researcher Lon suffered from claustrophobia, the fear of enclosed spaces. Then the hunt was on for the 2 members of Foundation military personnel who'd escort Lon to the MRV to take the readings. Like the 2 priests in The Exorcist, they decided to recruit 1 grizzled, experienced operative and 1 extremely cautious young buck straight out of the Foundation MTF Training Academy. The younger of the 2 operatives, codenamed Agent 2, was careful and conscientious to a fault. He did things by the book, or not at all. The older operative, codenamed Agent 6, was quite the opposite. He'd done this job long enough to operate solely on instinct, and resented his employers for expecting him to approach his missions any other way. Lon, Agent 2, and Agent 6. The team was assembled, and when the time came, they were taken to SCP-015 to execute their mission. It should have been simple enough. Get in, collect the readings, and get back out. Though a few weeks earlier, the same thing would have been said for the mission to install the MRV, which left for Mobile Task Force operatives dead or worse. Nothing was ever as simple as it seemed when it came to SCP-015. They were only allowed flashlights inside. Anything else carried a substantial risk of activating SCP-015's defensive state, putting all of their lives in jeopardy. Lon had tried to keep things light, masking her own terrible fear at this strange new situation. She joked that perhaps the 3 of them should get Mario hats, seeing as they were plumbers now. Agent 2 happily laughed along, suggesting that perhaps he should be Luigi. Agent 6 was utterly unamused by this whole situation and wanted no part of it, which is honestly just so Wario of him. They followed along a carefully mapped route through the pipes, being careful not to touch any of them. After all, you never know what could set SCP-015 off. Agent 6 didn't share in their merriment or their concern. In fact, he had contempt for them and this whole situation. He thought Lon and Agent 2 were a pair of frightened, skittish children, willing to buy whatever Foundation-assigned bull honky they were given. He didn't believe that SCP-015 was anywhere near as dangerous as they'd been told. In all likelihood, knowing the eggheads up top, they just didn't want men of action like him breaking any of their precious little toys while conducting missions on their behalf. This whole thing was a big, stupid joke. As they ducked and weaved through the confines of SCP-015, the tensions between them all just silently grew. Their flashlights played among the pipes, revealing the insane variety of shapes, sizes, compositions, and materials in here. Wood, steel, flesh, bone, glass, pressed ash, granite, and so much more. and yet there were no pipes comprised of any standard pipe-making material, like lead, PVC plastic, or copper. It was undeniably freaky, but when you work with SCPs for long enough, you learn to stop asking questions about the more minor forms of strangeness inherent to anomalies. The composition only got narrower as they delved deeper into the warehouse. Lon felt the anxiety, like a hand gripping her throat and squeezing, but tried still to keep it hidden. Agent 6, the largest among them, almost got stuck a few times, trying to crawl into spaces too tight for him to fit. He felt like murdering Lon when she threw out a casual comparison to Winnie the Pooh in the process. When they reached the MRV, it gave them an ounce of momentary relief. The journey was halfway done. But the comfort was quickly squashed by seeing what had actually happened to the MRV. It had been speared by a pipe, and new pipes had grown through and out of it, effectively rooting it in place. This caused immediate debate among the group around one key issue. Did this mean that the MRV was now technically part of the pipes? And by extension, would the pipes feel the need to defend themselves if the databanks were removed from the MRV in order to deliver the readings back to the researchers at Site-17? While Lon and Agent 2 carefully discussed the issue, Agent 6 lost his temper and decided to show these two foolish kids how it was done. He claimed the two of them were worrying about a bunch of Foundation hooey that they were inexperienced and gullible enough to believe, as if this bunch of weird pipes was actually dangerous. It was like how every 6 anomalies there's apparently one capable of ending the world. It's all a bunch of overblown, fear-mongering nonsense. And to prove that he wasn't just all talk on this front, Agent 6 pried open the top of the MRV and slid out the data cards, which seemed to be covered in some kind of viscous, unpleasant liquid from the pipes that had penetrated the device. Still, he'd gotten what they came for. He could have done this whole thing alone without this pair of bedwetters. He scoffed and said, "Kids, I don't know how you two survive." But he shouldn't have spoken so soon. The large pipe that he didn't even realize he was standing on opened up beneath his feet, and seconds later he was immersed up to his shoulders in it. 6 began to let out the most horrifying shrieks you've ever heard, and when Agent 2 and Lon ran over to try and help him out, they realized why. The pipe below Agent 6 was filled with flowing molten iron. By the time they pulled Agent 6 out, well, Agent 6 from the shoulders up, considering that that was all that was left, he was already dead. And despite the actual aggressor being destroyed, SCP-015 wasn't done. It was ready to clean house. As Agent 2 and Lon attempted to flee, some eye-level pipes around them burst, firing crystallized glass into their faces, cutting into their skin and eyes. But they needed to push on, despite the pain if they wanted to survive and get out. The two of them ran, horrifying noises of twisting and bursting pipes roaring behind them. Pipes made of thorns and bones started to grow, blocking off their exits until they were trapped. Lon, utilizing her small frame, was able to crawl through a gap in the pipes into an adjoining chamber. 2 was given a horrifying surprise when a pipe burst near his hand, showering his flesh in thick, corrosive gunk. His hand melted away at the wrist. As Lon called for help in the tiny cramped chamber she was locked in, 2 ran off to try and find an exit where he could bring more people in to help them. But it would already be too late for poor Lon. A thick, honey-like substance began bleeding into the chamber, disgusting in its overpowering saccharine flavor and goopy, viscous thickness. The chamber seemed to get smaller and smaller as Lon screamed as the honey level rose. Eventually, it got higher than her mouth and nose could reach. She gave a horrifying final gurgle, and then she was gone, entombed forever between the pipes. Agent 2 kept running. His flashlight was beginning to die, but he didn't care. As his eyes bled from the splinters of glass and what was left of his hand dripped from the jagged nub of his wrist, all he could do was keep moving forwards. He panted and screamed and stumbled in the dark until he tripped on something he didn't notice and pitched forwards. He tumbled into the gaping maw of a nearby pipe, surrounded by unseeable, unknowable ooze. As he tumbled further down into the seemingly infinite darkness, it was too dark to see and too cramped to move anywhere but straight down. All he could do was scream and scream and scream, until his voice was hoarse and his throat bled, though nobody was there to even hear his cries. Days later, when his skin started to shred off, it was almost welcome. Dr. Gears would later receive the news of this tragically failed mission and the 3 operatives now declared MIA because of it. He sighed and wrote up his report on the matter, closing with the sentence, "Data deemed non-vital in light of lost staff. SCP-015 classification level review suggested." A month ago, Dr. Robert Maxwell was a senior researcher working at the facility, but a tragic mistake had cost the lives of several of his co-researchers. Now he was being led down a bleak hallway in Armed Biocontainment Area 14, a rifle-wielding guard flanking him on either side. The once rising researcher had a very different title now, D-8724. He had been made a D-class personnel, a death sentence. However, as the guards led him to his possible demise, he wasn't dressed in the typical D-class orange jumpsuit. No, he was dressed in frilly Rococo dining wear more typical of 18th century France. If anything, Dr. Maxwell looked like he was on his way to meet royalty, and in a sense, he was. The former researcher had begged for any other assignment, but the site director insisted on committing Dr. Maxwell to tea time with SCP-082. He'd always been the talkative type, so the two would make a perfect pairing. And if the creature found him sufficiently amusing, then Maxwell might even leave the containment cell alive. He had heard legends of the giant creature they called the Cannibal. Maxwell hoped they were just stories. Dr. Maxwell was pushed by the guards into a large, luxuriously appointed room, and the doors were locked behind him. He felt like a child, surrounded by freakishly large furniture and 10-foot-high ceilings. The fog of obnoxious floral perfumes couldn't fully cover up the pervasive smell of death that lingered in the cavernous halls of 082's palace. Thanks to an elaborate ruse conducted by the Foundation, SCP-082 believed he was the King of France, and that his containment cell was a palace where he remained for his own safety. The creature's continued good behavior and everyone else's safety relied on visitors keeping up that lie. Maxwell had never worked in this area of the facility, so a lot of the standard procedures were new to him. Still, his superior had given him a clear directive: talk to the monster, communicate with him, be cordial and friendly, see if you can find out more about his mysterious past, and most importantly, if you want to survive, don't annoy him. The down-on-his-luck scientist gulped and sighed, trying to steady his nerves in this oversized fake French palace. He just kept thinking, surely he can't be that big. He almost talked himself into believing that the accounts of the creature were just that, tall tales, until a huge figure began lumbering into the main chamber. It was him, SCP-082, also known as Fernand the Cannibal. SCP-082 was an 8-foot-tall hulking monster, built sturdier than the castles it likes to imagine are its true home. Swollen, bloated, and grossly out of proportion, the creature clocks in at over 700 pounds, most of which is pure muscle that's almost impossible to pierce with conventional weaponry. SCP-082 stopped just feet away and stared at Dr. Maxwell with its beady, sunken-in eyes like a hungry rat. Just the sight of it struck terror into Dr. Maxwell's heart, but he didn't dare show his fear. Instead, he remembered his brief training, bowing politely and forcing a smile, referring to the creature as Your Highness, and profusely thanking it for granting him an audience. The monster continued staring without saying anything, and then gave a wide, lockjawed grin, showing off its huge teeth. It did everything through gritted teeth, except eat and sing. Dr. Maxwell hoped he wouldn't be a part of either activity. Fernand gave a low, booming chuckle. He thanked Dr. Maxwell for coming to give him some company and invited him to come further inside and take a seat, adding, with a sly wink, that he won't bite. The monster complained that he so rarely gets visitors to the palace these days, but he omitted the fact that the main reason for this was his tendency to devour them. Maxwell nodded and followed the giant deeper into its oversized abode. He couldn't help but notice that the monster's arms looked like huge, fleshy punching bags. He knew that if Fernand wanted to, he could easily crush him flat, just like he'd done to so many unfortunate guards during containment breaches. Fernand told Dr. Maxwell that he was thinking of having some decorating work done. The walls of his palace were starting to look awfully drab, and he gestured to one covered with a rusty red streak. Maxwell remembered that D-class cleaners were sent into the containment cell twice a month to tidy any of Fernand's messes, but they often ended up becoming one of the messes themselves. The creature encouraged Maxwell to take a seat at his oversized dining table, while he tended to a pot of what he said was full of delicious onion soup. Maxwell obliged his host's request and took a seat at a huge chair that made him look like a 6-year-old sitting at the grown-ups table. Meanwhile, Fernand was using a huge machete-like knife to cleave onions in half for his bubbling pot of stew. Even though Fernand had shown no signs of outward aggression, as he watched the cannibal hack away at onions with his enormous knife, Maxwell could feel himself beginning to sweat. After all, they didn't call this creature the Cannibal for nothing. This was a monster with a truly horrifying body count. During previous containment breaches, it had taken enough tranquilizer to put down 2 elephants to subdue the creature, but not before multiple agents quite literally lost their heads in the process. Fernand was able to bite them off with one huge chomp like he was eating a drumstick, snapping right through the bone with his incredible tooth and jaw strength. Surprisingly, when he wasn't on a violent rampage, Foundation researchers had found SCP-082 to be unusually polite and forthcoming, offering the researchers plenty of information about himself and his past. The only problem was that almost everything the creature said was a complete lie. From his time as a researcher, Maxwell knew that there were only a few details about the creature that could be ascertained for certain. SCP-082 would reliably answer to the name Fernand, and genetically, Fernand was technically human. The means by which Fernand became so grotesquely huge, strong, and cannibalistic are still unknown. Foundation personnel are still looking into whether it's due to some kind of anomalous genetic mutation or by more supernatural means. All we know is that he's big, unpredictable, and extremely dangerous. Dr. Robert Maxwell sat terrified at the dining table of SCP-082, listening to Fernand's slightly dull blade chop through the final onion, which he then tossed into the boiling soup. Fernand had switched the topic of conversation to one of his favorite fictional characters, Hannibal Lecter. Of course, Hannibal the Cannibal isn't quite so fictional to Fernand. While he's been shown to be extremely intelligent in terms of puzzle solving and memory, he seems to have no understanding of the distinctions between fiction and reality. He assumes all movies and TV shows are a form of documentary or reality television. And ever since seeing The Silence of the Lambs, Fernand has been eager to meet with Dr. Lecter, which he emphasized to Maxwell over and over. Since trying to explain the concept of fiction to Fernand had never previously worked, Maxwell simply told him that Dr. Lecter is extremely busy at the moment, but will visit whenever he gets a chance. This seemed to satisfy Fernand, who placed 2 large bowls of steaming soup on the table before sitting down a little too close to Maxwell. He couldn't help but notice that the giant cannibal was now sitting within biting distance, and as a lowly D-class, nobody would be rushing in to save him if things went south. Fernand began ranting through his clenched teeth once more, occasionally stopping to consume a hefty spoonful of onion soup. Maxwell was sure to do the same, not wanting to seem anything less than polite. But soon the tenor of Fernand's rant began to shift. Typically, the monster spoke French or heavily accented English. Now he was affecting the accent of a Victorian gentleman, peppering his speech with "tally-ho" and "the game is afoot." Maxwell was confused at first, but quickly realized the game Fernand was playing. It's well known that Fernand is a pathological liar who likes to play numerous characters, changing his mannerisms and clothes accordingly. These personas have included a vampire, Big Bird, Andre the Giant, Foundation researcher Dr. Bright, the Incredible Hulk, Alexander the Great, Captain Hook, Dr. Frankenstein, and Frankenstein's monster. And, of course, in this case, the iconic fictional detective, Sherlock Holmes. Fearing for his life in this strange situation, Dr. Maxwell did the only thing he could: play along. As Fernand reeled off his Holmesian delusions, Maxwell began to play the role of Dr. John Watson, asking follow-up questions and complimenting Fernand's impeccable deductive reasoning. And it seemed to be working. Fernand played along too, acting as though the two of them really were Arthur Conan Doyle's crime-fighting duo. Towards the end of their game, Dr. Maxwell was even starting to enjoy it, amazed that his quick thinking was actually keeping him safe. But just then, the cannibal froze, as if in a trance. He locked eyes with Dr. Maxwell, like a mad dog that you can't tell if it's going to bite you or not. He saw the creature's gargantuan teeth separating, its huge jaws stretching open. This could surely only mean one thing. Dr. Maxwell winced and prepared for death, cursing that all of his quick thinking had amounted to nothing. Fernand leaned towards him, his gaping maw with its hot onion-scented breath just inches away from Maxwell. And then, he began to sing. The cannibal broke into a raucous Victorian pub song, happy and jovial. In his moment of terror, Dr. Maxwell had forgotten that this was the other reason SCP-082 opens his nightmarish jaws. Relief washed over him, as he knew he was safe, at least for the moment. Not long after, Foundation guards arrived and escorted him from the cell, leaving the delusional giant to his own devices back in the so-called palace. The former researcher had done it. He had bested Fernand the Cannibal, and hopefully it would be the last time he'd ever be face to face with that deranged giant. Unfortunately for Dr. Robert Maxwell, in a performance review later that week, one of his superiors remarked that Fernand enjoyed his company and he had done a great job. Such a good job, in fact, that Fernand insisted he have Dr. Maxwell for dinner, or any other meal for that matter, sometime very soon. Foundation researcher Marcus Hernandez was a professional in all aspects of his job. He was intelligent, being scouted for a job at the Foundation right out of college. He was brave, unyielding in the faces of the horrifying creatures and dangerous situations that working with the anomalous practically guaranteed. But most importantly, researcher Hernandez was cautious. He not only knew that keeping his hands at a fair distance from any newly discovered anomalous objects was a safe way to keep his head, he was also aware that it was sometimes better to take risks that would further his knowledge about an anomaly and how best to contain it. Sometimes those risks came with a price, like being part of the first team to study a recently discovered anomaly. To researcher Hernandez, it was better to lose the lives of the ones working to protect humanity from what lies in the dark than have any unsuspecting civilians stumble upon something potentially life-threatening. That's why he and his team took the assignment of studying SCP-1437 before anyone else in the Foundation was able to. They simply were not sure of what it was capable of, and researcher Hernandez's known attention to detail and cautious nature could best help the Foundation not only establish proper containment procedures, but also ensure that their own personnel were safe while doing so. As researcher Hernandez sat in the back of a jeep that rolled and tumbled over the arid landscape of the Mojave Desert, he reviewed what the Foundation knew about the anomaly. Unfortunately, it wasn't much. For starters, it was a 3-meter by 3-meter hole in the ground, originally thought to be an ordinary cave. As a result of its deceiving appearance, the anomaly went unnoticed for decades, until the Foundation picked up on a local story that was the talk of the town for a small group of camping and hiking hobbyists in Nevada. A camper, while out exploring and trekking through the dry dunes of the Mojave, was struck in the back of the neck with a U.S. quarter. While the object by itself is harmless, it came flying at the camper's body at an incredibly high speed, shooting from a large hole in the ground and striking hard enough to break the skin and wedge itself inside the camper's neck. After reaching the local hospital and getting the coin removed, it still left a small scar across the back of the camper's head. This unusual event prompted Foundation reconnaissance, which turned out to be entirely warranted, as observation of the surrounding area found several more objects buried around the area that were believed to have emerged from the hole, now designated as SCP-1437. A small canoe decorated with luminescent patterns, a calculator that added and subtracted letters instead of numbers, and a rotten apple core were all objects strewn around the immediate area. And if that's not strange enough, attempts to map out the hole failed, as all measuring equipment was lost after reaching a certain depth. Before the initial observation team picked up and left, SCP-1437 shot out large quantities of rock and dirt for over an hour, confirming that objects emerged from the hole at high speeds. Chemical analysis of the objects found around the area showed that they were composed of materials either unknown or not commonly found on Earth to warrant use in mass production. The observation team came up with a hypothesis. SCP-1437 was a hole that led to a parallel universe. and the objects it shot out originated in said location. Researcher Hernandez knew that this was just a hypothesis, but he had reviewed the lab results himself. Those objects certainly did not come from anywhere on Earth, and if the hole functioned as a gateway between worlds, that could explain why the measuring equipment was lost after a certain point. The Jeep came to a stop, and when researcher Hernandez stepped out, he came face to face with SCP-1437, a large hole sitting in the Mojave Desert. His crew was already hard at work, surveying and excavating the surrounding area for any other objects the hole had shot out that had been lost to time. A mobile analysis lab tent was set up in the distance, as well as several trailers for personnel living on site. Researcher Hernandez's personal decision to not use D-Class personnel in his research meant that each risk the SCP-1437 team took had to be calculated differently. They wouldn't send a person into the hole and risk loss of life when a drone could serve the same function without the potential drawbacks. But still, the initial observation team lost all of their equipment while trying to measure SCP-1437's depth. Why waste an expensive drone when the result would most likely turn out the same? It was these decisions that earned Hernandez's fame and respect at the Foundation, and over the next few weeks, his team was able to develop a wide knowledge base regarding SCP-1437 and establish safe containment procedures to keep the anomaly hidden from the public and easy to work with for Foundation personnel. First, a 2-meter-tall electric fencing unit was built around the perimeter of SCP-1437. This fence would not only keep unwanted trespassers out, but also had defensive capabilities due to the harmful electrical charge it could emit upon contact with an object. Groups of 3 security guard personnel were assigned to patrol this fence at all times, and they were instructed to deal with any trespassers through standard Foundation protocol. They would be taken into custody, interrogated, and as long as they were unaware of SCP-1437's anomalous properties, given a healthy dose of amnestics and released back into the general public. Anything that emerged from SCP-1437, be it a physical object or a living organism, would be cataloged by the Foundation and tested immediately for any potential hazards before further analysis could begin. If found to be safe, the items would be studied as much as possible. If not, they were stowed away in an area intended to keep them contained until a safe way to examine them was found. But perhaps the most important containment procedure researcher Hernandez established was the forbiddance of testing with SCP-1437. Due to the anomaly's mysterious nature and incredibly likely potential connection to parallel universes, testing could have grave and unforeseen consequences. When dealing with alternate or parallel timelines or realities, the Foundation is incredibly cautious and only interacts in ways that they're absolutely sure will not have any unexpected damage on baseline reality. That, and researcher Hernandez wasn't exactly keen on attracting the attention of these parallel universes without a solid understanding of who and what they were. As he would come to find, this inclination proved to be beneficial. As the team observed SCP-1437, they documented a number of notable objects that emerged from the hole, each supposedly originating from a parallel world. The first of which, however, was not anything the team hadn't seen before. The initial observation team sent to test whether SCP-1437 was actually anomalous had observed the hole emitting a mass of rock and dirt. For over an hour, SCP-1437 spewed earthen materials without stopping, filling the surrounding areas with debris. Since this was before the research team theorized the hole was connected to parallel realities, they weren't sure what to make of it. Was it a natural eruption? A poorly documented earthquake that somehow sent chunks of rock and dirt to the surface and shooting out of the hole? Though somewhat stumped, researcher Hernandez's team eventually came to a single solid conclusion. If SCP-1437 led to a parallel world or worlds, whoever was on the other side of the hole may have been attempting to fill it using natural materials. If they were attempting to fill it, could they be trying to contain it? Did the parallel world on the other side of SCP-1437 have its own foundation? This sudden thought gave researcher Hernandez pause and made him reconsider his hands-off approach to SCP-1437. Should his team attempt to contact whoever was on the other side? If it was a parallel branch of the Foundation, this behavior would be encouraged. The Foundation communicated with alternate versions of itself in time and space all of the time. The Department of Temporal Anomalies was built around this premise, but these were exceptions, not the rules, and communication with alternate foundations was always carried out with utmost safety and precaution. It was only done when there was a certainty that risk would be avoided. Researcher Hernandez was sure he made the correct decision, and he would stray away from attempting to contact those on the other side of the anomaly, even if they were another world's incarnation of the SCP Foundation. Weeks later, researcher Hernandez was awoken in the middle of the night by an excited assistant who, after calming herself down, informed him that SCP-1437 had spat out a new object. You have to forgive her. If you were out in the desert for weeks staring at a hole waiting for it to do something and it eventually did it, you'd be pretty excited too. When researcher Hernandez ran outside to see what the team was freaking out about, he could have jumped for joy too. SCP-1437 wasn't spitting out rocks and dirt anymore. This time, it was a map, clearly illustrated to depict the continent of North America. But upon closer inspection, the team noticed some very apparent differences from a traditional map in the geography of our world. The map was written entirely in Spanish, and the names of countries and states it listed didn't match their existing counterparts. In fact, the entire borderlines of the map were mismatched, out of place, and radically different from anything resembling North America. It listed the government of the entire continent of North America as La República Popular de Aguas Nuevas, or when translated to English, the People's Republic of New Waters. This exciting find was logged and archived, and it was only the first of a series of objects that emerged from SCP-1437. A few days later, another object was documented. This time, it was a photograph. After initial scans determined the object to be safe to view, not harboring any dangerous mimetic triggers upon viewing or anything of that nature, the team analyzed the picture to the best of their abilities. They saw a breathtaking vista of a city skyline, unlike anything possible on this world. Intertwined with buildings were massive structures that appeared to be made out of coral. They wrapped around skyscrapers, branching from the ground and sometimes emerging from the buildings themselves. The coral broke through the tops of the tallest buildings, putting the man-made titans to shame. In the far background, a massive flying creature can be seen, peacefully floating through the air. This otherworldly visual overwhelmed the team, but after the initial shock wore down, a keen-eyed junior researcher pointed out that many of the buildings resembled known landmarks, though they were radically altered in noticeable ways. This wasn't just any city. It was New York City, only this time with coral and giant floating creatures. Exactly what the Big Apple's been missing this entire time. But this was still comprehensible and understandable for the Foundation. SCP-1437's true weirdness was still yet to come. A few days after the photograph emerged, SCP-1437 shot out a truly peculiar find. Researcher Hernandez and his team were stumped as to what its purpose was and what it signified, but they determined the objects to be completely safe and archived them regardless. The items in question were a series of discs made from solid gold, varying in size but never being obscenely large. Accompanying the disc was a sheet of paper that read, "Please send more rain." The Foundation was understandably puzzled. One working theory researcher Hernandez put together was that whoever was on the opposite side of SCP-1437 was paying tribute to the whole as a form of worship and was asking the almighty beings on the other side to send more rain for whatever reason. While the Foundation didn't exactly send the rain over themselves, whoever sent that request was probably pleased when a thunderstorm the next week sent torrents of rainwater into SCP-1437. We hope they're happy. The most notable discoveries that emerged from SCP-1437 occurred over a multi-year period. Previously, the research team theorized that SCP-1437 was connected to a single reality, and that whoever was on the other side of it was sending objects through, either by chance or by means of communication. This discovery proved that there wasn't just one parallel world connecting to SCP-1437, but many, an unknown amount, in fact. The items in question this time weren't just objects, but human cadavers. One by one over the years, interspaced between the various oddities that SCP-1437 also spat out were human corpses, dead on arrival. The bodies were clad in Foundation-issue D-Class uniforms, though with some slight variations. This proved that the worlds connected to SCP-1437 were, in fact, alternate versions of the Foundation. or at least some of the worlds, as there was no way to tell who, what, or where the objects that emerged from SCP-1437 came from. Researcher Hernandez and his team examined the bodies with care and determined that they were dead long before they hit the ground, and that the gateway between worlds triggered the cause of death as they traveled between realities. Inside the D-Class jumpsuits, the team discovered pieces of paper, manuscripts that detailed their world's Foundation's documentation on SCP-1437. This deliberate inclusion of documentation signaled to the research team that there was an attempt at communication and cooperation from one world's Foundation to theirs. But why? The first body was clearly in adequate physical condition. It was protected due to being clothed in a pressure suit with an attached oxygen supply. The documentation read similarly to the SCP Foundation's documentation, though instead of special containment procedures and an object class, SCP-1437 was given a safety rating and safety containment procedures. These detail the Foundation that was giving civilians tours of their anomalies, where they could take photographs and even get close enough to view the anomaly from a close distance. The rest of the file was similar to what Hernandez's team recorded, and listed the following objects as those that emerged from SCP-1437. One small pyramid composed of concrete, large quantities of dirt and rocks, a landscape painting, believed to be a location in Scotland. According to the painting, its originating universe's sun is blue and its sky yellow. Several discs made from solid gold. Accompanying the discs was a sheet of paper reading, "Please stop plague." A photograph of several scientists. All scientists pictured have unusually long fingers, estimated to be nearly 25 centimeters long. A sheet of paper reading, "Thank you, please send more gifts." The file continued with a notice explaining that the bodies of orange jumpsuited individuals holding documentation of the anomaly emerged from the hole. The file's unfamiliarity with jumpsuits indicate that this world lacks a concept of D-Class personnel. The file mentions that, on the 15th of August 2012, a volunteer from the Foundation, Marco Perton, entered SCP-1437 wearing safety gear, taking with him a copy of this document. The second D-Class body examined by Hernandez's team was branded with the phrase, "Property of the SCP Corporation." The file described an item with a threat level of little, and a Foundation that was more focused on profit than containment. After objects emerged from the hole, they were authorized to be sold to any interested collectors. Objects described by this version of the Foundation include a statue of what is believed to be a reptilian entity sporting numerous eyes and tails, large quantities of dirt and rocks, a glass bottle of water, a human femur covered in saliva, a cube comprised of several smaller cubes, all of which are different colors, purpose unknown, a soccer ball. Ball only has 5 sides. The file included the SCP Corporation describing D-Class showing up, as they did in other worlds, and then the Corporation happily sending several D-Classes of their own through the hole in an attempt to communicate with whoever was on the other side. The third D-Class body examined was heavily bandaged and appeared to be blinded. There were lacerations on its arms and legs, and its tongue had been removed. The file described a Foundation akin to a religious cult. SCP-1437 was given a heathen level of unforgivable, and its holding measures described a high priest having to bless the hole every 2 years, and the need to perform blood sacrifices into it to ward off any demons. The wild incarnation of the Foundation interpreted SCP-1437 as a portal to the underworld, and described a list of objects emerging from it. It read as follows: several discs made from solid gold. Accompanying the disc was a sheet of paper reading, "Please kill foes." Large quantities of dirt and rocks, believed to be an attempt by demons to harm the High Priest, who was present at the holding site at the time. The broken remains of a human arm, covered in saliva. A photograph of a metal bird flying away from a city. What appears to be a large mushroom is visible behind the bird, believed to be an attempt by demons at mocking us. A human eye which moved when touched, believed to be a lesser demon, was burnt immediately. Unlike the other worlds, when this one received D-Classes through SCP-1437, the religious fanatics believed the bodies to be demons wearing the skin of men, and threw the bodies back in the hole. The next D-Class body observed by Hernandez's team was the most curious. It was a heavily emaciated child, who had apparently been lobotomized. It described a Foundation that sounds more like an organization out of a dystopian science fiction novel than anything else. The file spoke of a group of beings referred to as our masters above all, which the Foundation answered to. Any objects emerging from SCP-1437 were brought before the Masters. Any trespassers were interrogated by the Masters. This Foundation believed the objects SCP-1437 shot out were gifts for the Masters. Their list reads as follows. 1. Diamond. Large quantities of dirt and rocks. Bark from the extinct Quercus buckii, the lower half of a human body. Delivering to supervising servant of our Masters above. It is currently unknown how the gift sender was aware of the diet of our Masters above. A document was sent into SCP-1437 thanking the gift giver for the object and requesting further tributes to our Masters above. A bottle of human-intended wine. While they certainly enjoyed the food of the human body, the wine was clearly misinterpreted. For whatever reason, this Foundation interpreted the wine as an assassination attempt on the Masters above all. As a result, they sent a large, anomalously powered explosive through SCP-1437 and into the world of an unsuspecting Foundation. The file continues with a notice from this Foundation's 05-1 which reads, "This is a reminder of why we must be vigilant in our containment procedures. From now on, I don't want any of these gifts being taken out of containment. They are a clear and present danger to our Masters above." Looks like researcher Hernandez had the correct idea about not wanting to risk experimenting with SCP-1437. Attracting the attention of a reality where the almighty O5 Council answers to an even more powerful human-eating group of Masters above all? No, thank you. This reality's Foundation is perfectly content alone. Every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. It's an iconic line from It's a Wonderful Life, and even if you don't believe in angels, it is a pleasant image. After all, angels are the embodiment of goodness and light, so an angel getting its wings has to be a good thing, right? Well, as anyone who's ever eaten one too many Christmas cookies can tell you, it's possible to have too much of a good thing. Even something that sounds like the embodiment of all things good in theory can become deadly when taken to the extreme. That is where SCP-469, also known as the Many-Winged Angel, comes in. This angel-like creature is anything but innocent, and in fact it has been responsible for multiple deaths of SCP Foundation personnel during its captivity. SCP-469 may be deadly, but it is also undeniably beautiful in a mysterious, ethereal way. When first seen, it appears to be nothing more than a massive pile of pristine white feathers, like something out of a pillow commercial. The pile measures 24 feet in diameter and weighs at least 2 tons. However, like many of the entities contained within the walls of the Foundation's countless containment sites, all is not as it seems with 469. What looks at first glance to be a pile of feathers is in fact a dense, curled mass of giant wings. The wings vary in size from the tiny wingspan of a sparrow to the staggering 3.6-meter wingspan of the wandering albatross. The one thing they have in common is their plumage, with each wing being covered with the same glossy white feathers. The Foundation was able to perform a series of X-rays on the massive wings, revealing a skeletal structure beneath the feathers. Like those of a bird, the wings' bones are hollow. However, they are unnaturally soft and flexible, allowing for a range of motion that no known bird possesses. This accounts for the curvature of the wings and their ability to coil tightly into each other. The X-ray also provided the first and only recorded glimpse at the creature hiding underneath all the feathers. At the center of the layers upon layers of wings is a humanoid creature curled into a fetal position. In defiance of the laws of natural anatomy, every single wing appears to be fused to this creature's spine. How would it be able to move under the weight of these wings, or even if it could, is as of yet unknown. The first Foundation personnel lost to SCP-469 were D-Class personnel D-112 and D-624, who were sent in to investigate the nature of the creature and attempt to contact the humanoid entity identified on the X-rays. 112 and 624 entered the room, equipped with gloves and protective eye gear, as scientists watched the situation unfold on a monitor on a video feed. No one expected much to come of the encounter. The working hypothesis was the layers of feathers would simply be too thick to get through without seriously damaging the bones. It would be a fairly uneventful experiment, or so they thought. 112 approached SCP-469 first, and attempted to part a section of its feathers with his hands as 624 stood back and observed. The moment his fingertips touched the feathers, a rustling sound filled the room. The feathers began to quiver, shaking as if all waking up at once from a deep slumber. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, the hundreds and hundreds of wings unfurled and pulled 112 into their depths. He was swept into a swirl of feathers, and within seconds, he had disappeared from view completely. Though 624 and the scientists watching on their monitor could no longer see him, they could certainly hear him. From the moment the wings pulled him into the sea of feathers, 112 had begun to scream in agony. His screams persisted, growing louder and more desperate even as the voice cracked and grew weak. 624 stood, frozen in place with fear and shock. 624 was ordered to attempt to retrieve 112 from the feathers, but made no move to do so. He simply stared at the feathers, eyes wide, face pale, as the pained shrieks of his colleague bounced off the sterile white walls of the containment room. A guard called over the intercom, threatening to terminate 624 if he did not attempt to remove 112 from SCP-469's grasp. This warning seemed to shock 624 back into action, and he made a run for the center feathers, arms up to protect his face. Again, the sound of rustling as the feathers began to quake. The wings unfurled once more, and 624 did not even have a chance to turn back before he was pulled in to meet the same dismal fate as the other D-Class. His screams of pain joined 112 as the scientists watching over the monitor could do nothing to help them. As the two men cried out in pain and horror from within their winged prison, something began to happen that the scientists had never seen before. The feathers started to shake again, faster than before, and at first the wings appeared to be unfolding again. Upon second look, though, it was clear they hadn't moved. There were simply more of them now. As the men continued to scream, more feathers appeared, the wings stretching out and elongating as new wings sprouted as if from nowhere. SCP-469 appeared to be feeding on the sound of their screams, and using that energy to expand. It was only after several long minutes when the screaming finally stopped that the growth of the wings did too. At this point, the wings shifted again, expelling the bodies of 112 and 624 from within its folds, dropping them limply on the ground. Though their deaths were unfortunate, the loss of 112 and 624 did reveal some new information about SCP-469. First, that it could grow, and apparently needed to feed on sounds in order to do so. Second, that it was deadly to humans, and most likely to other living things as well. Autopsies of 112 and 624's corpses would later reveal exactly what happened to them, and how SCP-469 kills its prey. Though 469's feathers may look as though they would be soft to the touch, each feather is actually made up of sharp barbs that are capable of piercing clothing and skin. These barbs release a neurotoxin into the system that activates every pain receptor in the body of the victim. The neurotoxin present in these feathers has not been identified anywhere else in nature, but is somewhat similar in structure and function to the neurotoxins excreted by the cone snail and in the bite of the blue-ringed octopus. In addition to the pain-inducing neurotoxin, the feathers also carry several unidentified stimulant compounds, where the neurotoxin on its own would induce enough pain for the affected party to pass out almost immediately. The stimulant served to keep the victim conscious. SCP Foundation scientists posit that this is so that 469 can get as much noise, in this case in the form of screams, out of its pain as possible, and achieve maximum growth before the captive creature dies or goes into shock. Further experiments confirmed this theory, and showed that SCP-469 will react similarly when exposed to any living creature capable of making a sound and experiencing pain, not just humans. Non-living matter, though, including dead animals, elicit no response from 469. Additional experiments were then undertaken that involved applying various different sounds in order to test their effect on SCP-469's growth. Though it feeds on any sounds produced in its presence, it seems to respond most strongly to musical sounds, exhibiting a particularly strong response to classical music. No sound elicits a stronger reaction from this creature, however, than the sound of ringing bells. It is rumored that when a bell was rung in the presence of 469, the humanoid at the center of the feathers is said to have moved for the first time on record. Apparently, whatever is at the center appeared to wake up and unfurl its wings, revealing itself. But unfortunately, all security footage of this incident has been wiped, and the data has been expunged from the record, leaving the creature's true form a mystery. You may be remembering that 4 members of Foundation personnel on record were lost to SCP-469, and that only 2 have been mentioned so far. The second pair of casualties resulted when the Foundation attempted to terminate SCP-469, believing that there was no more scientific benefit to keeping it alive, or at least that the possible benefits did not outweigh the risks. It was ordered that SCP-469 be terminated by any means necessary. 2 skilled personnel, Dr. Jones and Dr. Smith, were sent into the containment facility in hazmat gear, armed with several sharp instruments. They were to attempt to use these to cut through the forest of feathers and soft bones until they could reach the humanoid at the center. It was presumed that once they did, and the creature no longer had the protection of its poisonous feathers, that it would be relatively easy to kill. They could not have been more wrong. Dr. Jones approached the dense cover of feathers with a pair of sharpened gardening shears, while Dr. Smith opted for a machete. At first, the strategy appeared to be working. Dr. Jones made several quick cuts, with feathers fluttering to the floor and sticking to the hazmat suit as Dr. Smith slashed into the feathers with his machete, making similarly promising progress. However, the situation quickly took a turn for the worse when Dr. Jones dropped her shears and let out a blood-curdling scream. The feathers had taken a little longer to get through the suit to her skin, but somehow they managed to find a way just the same. Smith grabbed Jones and attempted to make a break for it, but he was too slow and far too close to the feathers already. The wings wrapped around them and swallowed them both up, leaving the researchers outside helpless to do anything but listen to their screams and wait for them to go quiet. After several minutes, they finally did, and now larger SCP-469 had officially claimed another 2 Foundation personnel. Obviously, 469 could not be terminated using any methods that would place the responsible personnel within its grasp. That was simply too risky. So the Foundation selected a team of D-Class personnel to attempt to burn the feathers with an array of flamethrowers. Though the feathers were vulnerable to fire and began to blacken and disintegrate on contact, the sound of the flames being expelled was loud enough to feed SCP-469. Its growth was so quick in response to the noise that the fire could not keep up with the amount of new feathers and wings being produced. By the same time the flamethrowers ran out of propellant, 469 was the same size it had been when they started. Other terminations have been discussed, including the possibility of submerging the entire creature in a highly corrosive acid, but so far this has not yet been attempted. Whatever they end up trying, it is clear that nothing that produces a significant amount of noise will be able to kill 469. So where is it now? What's become of this perverse angel with the never-ending wings? Currently, it is kept in an airtight, soundproof chamber where nothing can trigger the growth of any more wings. So, what is it? An angel? A demon? A twisted, mutated bird of some kind? It is entirely possible that we will never know. But It's a Wonderful Life had something right, even by accident. Every time a bell rings, something, twisted and deadly though it may be, gets its wings. We're all familiar with viral diseases, especially over the past 2 years. The deadliness and severity of a virus cannot be understated. Whether it's COVID-19, influenza, or any other of the countless infectious diseases that plague humanity. We're all familiar with the bubonic plague, the Black Death which wiped out an estimated 25 million people in the Middle Ages, a third of Europe's population at the time. But that was during an era in which medieval advances were limited to the sickening practice of bloodletting, which drained a patient of their blood until all bacteria left their system, or washing the body with vinegar. Of course, none of these methods had any effect on staving off the Black Death, and the epidemic went down in history as one of the darkest periods of civilization. But for all our technological and medical advances in the field of health and medicine, infectious diseases are still as much of a threat now as they were back then, if not a greater one. Think about it. In today's world, everything is heavily connected. Globalization means that we travel more, import more products than ever before, and with such a high population density, it's difficult to keep anything under control due to the sheer amount of people there are in the world. Complete eradication of a viral disease has proven extremely difficult in even the strictest, most regimented campaigns to do so. Vaccines, while effective, still require time to develop, roll out, and treat. Take, for example, the smallpox virus. For centuries, this deadly disease slayed entire populations, killing millions with a mortality rate of 40%. In the 20th century, the world's governments and medical organizations worked tirelessly to come up with a vaccinated cure for the disease, and their efforts eventually paid off. A successful vaccine was developed, and only the trickling of cases of smallpox were documented in Somalia in the 1970s. Today, all that remains of the disease are contained samples held in high-security laboratories across the world, explicitly used for research purposes. But smallpox's story is not the norm. Other diseases you may not realize are still lurking in the shadows are polio and malaria. Polio being a disease affecting the central nervous system, with weakened muscle function as a result, and malaria being a mosquito-transmitted sickness that results in severe fevers and vomiting. The common perception is that these illnesses aren't actually a threat anymore and are nothing more than a relic of the past, but that isn't quite true. While they've been eliminated from some parts of the world, in polio's case, most first-world countries such as the United States and Europe still have some documented cases that crop up from time to time. But the future is hopeful, with only under 50 cases of polio documented worldwide in the year 2018, and malaria's worldwide eradication program seeing success year by year. Maybe the world will one day be fully wiped of these terrible illnesses. But why are we telling you this during a video about the SCP Foundation? Because the subject of today's video is also a deadly virus. But unlike the most ordinary variations we just discussed, this one is going to be a lot more difficult to eradicate fully. And by difficult, we mean next to impossible. As to be expected with an organization like the SCP Foundation, the threats they deal with are both similar to the ones the rest of the world's governments and large organizations do, and entirely, completely different. If you're a seasoned viewer of SCP Explained, chances are you are already familiar with more than a few anomalous viruses. They're unspeakably deadly, incredibly strange, and can put an infected victim through more pain and suffering than anything else in the world. It's a testament to the Foundation's thoroughness and capabilities that some of these diseases are even able to be concentrated in a manageable dose and contained inside a chamber at a secure facility. But for others, they're still out there, ready to strike at a moment's notice, and there's absolutely nothing the Foundation can do about it, except be as swift as possible in their retaliation. And there's no doubt that they're prepared. With the deadliness of an anomalous virus, which can spread at a more infectious rate and potentially alert the rest of the world to the supernatural happenings of the SCP Foundation and the objects they contain, an anomalous pandemic is one of the Foundation's greatest fears. Some anomalous diseases, as we mentioned before, are under the control of the Foundation. Take SCP-008, nicknamed the Zombie Plague, for example. SCP-008 is a deadly virus that, you guessed it, can essentially turn a patient into a zombie, reanimating their corpse after the sickness kills them. What makes SCP-008 unique is that it's entirely absent from the natural world, save for the places the Foundation has labeled G2 sites. These G2 sites are small pockets across the world in which the Foundation discovered SCP-008, which further research of such have determined that the disease may not have originated on Earth in the first place. Subjects infected by SCP-008 display symptoms within 3 hours of infection, which include flu-like symptoms, preceded by a coma, which is followed by death. But after death, the victim's body will continue to display lifeless signs of mortality, including a high durability to damage and a desire to ingest living humans on physical contact, just like a zombie. Research into SCP-008 is highly classified and left out from the original document because the Foundation has the right to fear that SCP-008 may be replicated in an unsuspecting laboratory one day. As such, containment efforts to prevent such research from bearing fruit are in place, backed by the Foundation's stranglehold over the ordinary scientific world. Thankfully, SCP-008 has mostly been destroyed, with samples contained solely at the G2 sites, which are now protected Foundation facilities located across the world. But the Foundation was lucky that SCP-008 was so easily contained. If the disease spread in larger numbers or originated from a natural source on Earth, we might be living in a world more like a zombie apocalypse movie than the one we know today. On the other side of the spectrum, you have SCP-3519, the Quiet Days virus. In one reality, SCP-3519 managed to kill off the entire world due to its severity and ease of infection. Unlike most anomalous diseases, SCP-3519 was a mimetic virus, meaning that its transmission wasn't just limited to the traditional means of physical contact, but the very idea of it permeating your mind would allow it to take root inside your body. SCP-3519 permeated the idea that the world would end on March 5, 2019, and that self-termination was a preferable option than living through the apocalypse and the terrible aftermath that would follow. SCP-3519 took society by storm, and the idea was transmitted through television broadcasts and news stories encouraging people to free themselves from the world, and even Foundation sites themselves. The Foundation was powerless, and the rapid rate of transmission proved too difficult for the organization to keep fully under control. The project to create a cure was greenlit, but one by one, as Foundation sites across the globe suffered massive die-offs and a loss of personnel, the research team dwindled down until there was only one person left, a junior researcher by the name of Rory Jones, who assumed the position of 05-6 in an emergency succession protocol that would promote the next highest member of the Foundation to the position in the event of an overseer dying. Jones was the only member of the Foundation left, and as far as he knew, camped up in a cabin in the woods with nothing but a few research materials and a computer terminal, the only man alive. The SCP-3519 timeline story proves just how quickly a deadly anomalous virus can get out of control. How it can make an organization as all-powerful and ever-prepared as the SCP Foundation just another statistic in a record of infected populations. But you don't need to tell the Foundation that. They're already well aware, and they've had decades to prepare, study, and analyze the effect an anomalous virus can have on the world. And that brings us to the mysterious case of the main anomaly we'll be looking at today, SCP-217, the Clockwork virus. Dr. Charles Gears, a researcher of note that you may have heard of before, was one of the Foundation's best and brightest. His cold, distant demeanor and propensity for researching the anomalous commonly associated with a divergent religion, the Church of the Broken God, a group of zealots focused on reassembling the broken metal pieces of their mechanical, technological god, made onlookers associate the Gears name with sleek, careless alloys and methodical, cold clockwork. When the Foundation began observing symptoms of what would later be labeled SCP-217 in a major population center, whose name would be scrubbed from all official documents, they knew Dr. Gears was the right man to head the research efforts. For years, the Foundation had observed strange medical records and reports from the city. Reports of dementia in subjects younger than the common age brackets and at uncommonly high rates. High reports of lethargy, depression, emotional dulling, and a feeling of something moving underneath the skin or a ticking noise in the ear were all signs that the Foundation was dealing with SCP-217. Dr. Gears was already familiar with the disease, having worked alongside efforts to study it in the past. This was not the first major population area affected by SCP-217, and there surely were more areas up next. Upon arriving and reading the initial reports, Dr. Gears requested to view a subject that the Foundation believed was suffering from SCP-217. When the young woman entered, Gears immediately recognized the signs, the stiff movements, the robotic, monotone voice, and the way that nothing he seemed to say fazed her. They were all clear-cut signs of SCP-217's infection. The girl was barely high school age, but she looked like she had all of her youth and life zapped out of her completely. It was a horrible sight to see. An X-ray was performed, and Gears saw for himself a definitive sign that SCP-217 had taken over her body. The X-ray imagery showed the inside of the girl's body, which had been converted from an ordinary mass of organs and tissues into a clockwork machine, composed of cogs, gears, screws, and wires. And as Gears knew, this would only get worse as time went on, with signs of her infection appearing outside the body as well as inside. Right now, there wasn't a shred of human tissue left inside her, and there was nothing the doctor could do about it. Gears thought about the girl's family, who had been anesthetized prior to the Foundation seizing their daughter for research purposes. And though the emotionless man would never let his facade down, his heart ached for her. But it wasn't only her. It was dozens of people inside the city the Foundation had documented as displaying symptoms of SCP-217. On a scale this high, there was little the Foundation could do except sit back, watch, and only act when the symptoms became too visible to hide. That was the tragedy of SCP-217, the Clockwork virus. It wasn't deadly, but it was a slow, more metaphorical death, from a person made of flesh and blood to a clockwork automaton that felt more like a shell than a living thing. The Foundation was more than familiar with SCP-217 though, and multiple samples are held inside a reverse-pressure airlocked containment chamber at a high-security site for research purposes, in hopes that one day, a cure could be developed. Personnel wanting to access SCP-217 samples have to don fully insulated hazmat suits, with chemical sterilization and endure a post-interaction quarantine period, with physical testing. All this being mandatory after they have finished their experiments with the virus. The severity of an SCP-217 infection cannot be understated, and any items touched by infected personnel have to undergo a strict sterilization process. The Foundation is perfectly justified in this overly cautious behavior too, because SCP-217 has an infection rate of 100%, meaning that it will transmit through physical contact all of the time without failure. But it doesn't just infect humans. The Clockwork virus has been observed to infect all multicellular organisms. From the smallest insect to an elephant, SCP-217 consumes and hollows out all it can. Clockwork beings rot from a clockwork virus, marching to the ticking of their innards in a hollow, empty world. If that sounds terrifying and like a nightmare, then congratulations. Chances are you're unaffected by SCP-217. If it sounds appealing, well, you might just be a mechanite ready to serve the Church of the Broken God, but we'll get to that connection later. SCP-217 is especially difficult to deal with due to its hardiness. It can survive for years outside a host body, and when it does find a suitable host, and trust us, there's no shortage in supply of them in the world, it can sometimes take years for symptoms of SCP-217 to manifest. It's a slow virus, and that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. The Foundation might not realize a large population area has been infected before it's too late, and that's exactly what happened before, with entire towns being infected by SCP-217. But what are those symptoms? Well, you might have already been able to guess so far that SCP-217 has to do with turning someone into a mechanical monstrosity, but there's a bit more to it than that. SCP-217 alters biochemistry in such a way that it causes organic matter to rearrange itself into an organic metal. Chemical scans of this metal reveal that there's still living cellular tissue and DNA present inside it, but it takes the appearance and feels indistinguishable from actual materials. This process occurs slowly over time, and advanced stages have shown that a subject's interior will resemble a machine, with a complicated mixture of gears and clockwork. This is subtle, barely noticed by the patient at first, with only vague feelings of confusion, insomnia, and joint stiffness. But as larger and larger parts of the body are converted, the subject experiences extreme pain. As Dr. Gears wrote in his research notes on SCP-217, hearts are replaced by gears and small tubes, joints by gear networks, eyes by structures not unlike primitive hand-crank film cameras, etc. SCP-217 in non-mammals shows first on the outside of the body. In mammals such as humans, SCP-217 converts the internals before being visible on the outside of the body. The reason for this is unknown, but it might have something to do with that broken god connection we mentioned earlier. One of the Church's core beliefs focuses on ascending humanity to reflect Mechane, the broken god. While the origins of SCP-217 are unknown, if the virus is related to the Mechanites, this subtle, slow infection may be a part of their grand design. A plan to covertly infiltrate society and convert the masses into effigies of their god. But of course, this is all speculation. As we mentioned, those infected by SCP-217 can be entirely unaware of their conversion until it's too late. But aside from physicality, the mental state is also affected. From the middle to advanced stages of SCP-217 infection, victims' behaviors reflect their cold, mechanical insides. They respond in a repetitive, disassociated fashion. Their actions are dull, mechanical, and telegraphed. They're easily distracted and confused, and appear irritable when faced with new problems. In the early stages, SCP-217 manifests as increased lethargy, a lack of emotional response, and a feeling of fluttering or moving underneath the skin. Always present are ticking noises, like those of a clock, that mainly manifest when SCP-217 infects the shoulders, neck, and head. But attempts to hear this noise using recording equipment have invariably failed, as the device will not pick up any sound if pressed against an affected area. As SCP-217's infection advances, the subject will experience excruciating pain, sharp, tearing sensations in the areas that are being converted into organic metal, comparable in feeling to a knife wound or a deep muscle tear. This feeling can persist for hours or days, depending on which area of the body is being affected and the subject themselves. After tearing the existing organs, the new parts will integrate into the tissue and settle into the body, producing pain. An analysis of this newly formed organic metal appears to be alloys of brass, steel, and iron varieties, but substances such as leather, rubber, glass, and wood have been observed. And observed is the key word, because as soon as these materials are examined deeper, it's revealed that they're still organic in composition, and even carry the subject's DNA. Organs and tissues affected will, however, become stronger. Instead of being squishy meat bags filled with tissue, blood, and other parts, they take on the physical properties, namely durability, of the material they resemble. If one of these areas are damaged, they'll repair over time just like regular organs, but at a much slower rate. But one interesting note is that a damaged piece of organic metal can be repaired, so to speak, by replacing damaged areas with new parts of the same type. This has had no consequences, and the body will continue to act as normal. That's one benefit of being infected by SCP-217. You can essentially repair yourself with whatever you have access to. But the conversion of a victim doesn't stop. It continues to occur until their entire body is organic metal, inside and out. Dr. Gears's research on a fully converted brain was apparently so groundbreaking that it had to be erased from the standard security class documentation. We can only speculate on what it contained. Possibly that connection to the broken god that we're so desperate to make? We don't know. But whatever it was, it hinted at something far larger than what a cursory look at SCP-217 seems to suggest. SCP-217 is truly one of the most dangerous anomalous viruses the Foundation has to deal with, having already infected hundreds of people in various population centers around the world, before containment methods can be properly established. So if you happen to start hearing the sounds of a tick here and a talk there, accompanied by a strange fluttering feeling under your skin, we're sorry to say, there's not much we can do for you now. Actually, nothing. There's nothing we can do. Now go check out SCP-914 The Clockworks and SCP-001 The Broken God or Borocycle for more Mechanite-related videos from SCP Explained.